Inside a massive estate, Rest gets the news that he's officially being stripped of his status as the heir and losing his family name. This is the story of a popular novel finally getting turned into a manga. The kid introduces himself as Rest Dine, but things aren't exactly how they used to be since that name was just taken away from him. He looks pretty drained as he processes the fact that it's the morning of his 18th birthday and he's just been kicked out of his own house. Rest walks away with his head down, looking like he's deep in thought. Moving on, a little smirk starts to crawl across his face, and his whole mood shifts. He pumps his fists in the air and cheers because he's finally free from his family, meaning he won't ever have to inherit the Dine family legacy or deal with their drama. On top of that, he's totally done with all the annoying customs and etiquette that come with being a noble. This all goes back to the Dine family, their high-ranking nobles in the kingdom, but Rest was honestly just over all the rules and stuff he had to do. While he's walking, a voice calls out to him. He turns around to see his younger stepbrother, Bergs, standing there. Rest realizes who it is and Bergs looks pretty worried, asking why Rest is out here all by himself without any servants. The kid looks down, saying he's really sorry he couldn't stop his mom from doing this. Rest just takes it in. He already knew his stepmother was plotting behind his back, doing everything she could to make her own son, Bergs, the next head of the family. But Rest just smiles and says it's totally fine, because now he can finally get away from all that suffocating noble drama, even though Bergs still looks like he's about to lose it. Bergs keeps talking about the location of the land Rest was given, looking pretty upset that his mother chose the completely undeveloped Eldoba Island as the place where Rest is supposed to go. Rest just realizes that's his new territory, while Bergs looks totally freaked out, yelling to make sure he heard that right. Rest stays calm, but mentions he actually thought he'd be sent to his stepmother's homeland in the Kyle territory, since it's way out on the frontier, scratching his head and figuring this choice just proves how much the lady actually hated him. Bergs tries to help out, saying he'll at least get a ship and some people together to go with him. Rest tells him thanks and says he really appreciates the kid going out of his way like that, leaving Bergs standing there with a look on his face like he's still feeling terrible about it all. Rest gives a small, genuine smile as he looks at his brother, letting Bergs know he really is an amazing younger brother for trying to help. He tells the kid not to worry about the situation at all, and mentions how Bergs is honestly way better suited to lead the family anyway. Bergs completely loses it, thinking his brother is just being brave for his sake, while Rest is just standing there thinking he's actually glad to be leaving. He honestly can't figure out why his brother is getting so emotional over this, especially when Bergs starts crying about not being strong enough to stop the exile. The sun starts setting over the massive stone walls of the family castle, as the birthday celebration continues with a huge cake sitting on the table. The dark-skinned maid finishes up the cooking and lets everyone know the food is ready, while Rest walks through the door with a big smile, announcing that he's finally back. The red-haired maid greets him immediately, wishing him a happy birthday as he joins them. Everyone sits down for a massive feast, and one of the maids asks Rest what kind of place his new home on Eldoba Island is. The question catches the younger maid off guard, making her freeze up with a blank look. Kieta clears his throat and tells the table that he'll be the one to explain the situation, since he knows the history, explaining that the name Eldoba literally translates to the farthest reaches. He goes on to describe it as a completely isolated rock covered in giant cliffs with an unsettling vibe, even mentioning that the kingdom totally gave up on trying to investigate the place. Hearing that their lord is being sent to such a sketchy island leaves the maids looking completely stressed out. Rest leans back with a chill look, telling everyone not to worry because they'll find a way to make it work. He mentions that Bergs is even sending a few of his guys to help out, but only until they actually get to the island. As they look over the estate, he thanks them for everything and asks them to keep an eye on his brother while he's gone. The girls aren't just going to let him go alone though. One of the maids looks on, clearly worried about him leaving. Tareen steps up and says she's going with him, since taking care of him is her actual job after all. Then Agni chimes in, telling Rest he's being way too casual about this and asking who's even going to cook if she stays behind. Fail jumps in too, waving her hand and shouting that she's definitely coming along, which leaves Rest pretty surprised. She's actually hyped because she thinks the whole thing sounds like a blast, and Rest can't believe she's taking it like this. Agni just sighs at the energy, saying the whole vibe feels more like they're heading out on a field trip than a dangerous mission. Rest's eyes light up at that, and he gets completely hooked on the idea of this being a big field trip. Rest leans into the idea and tells everyone they're right. It really is just a field trip, and he explains that he even got his hands on the kingdom's official survey data for the island, so they're totally set, which makes Fail get even more excited as she asks if she can bring snacks along for the ride. Rest is all for it, and while Tareen thinks it sounds like a blast, Kieta just sighs like he can't believe these kids. Moving on, the scene shifts down to the docks where everyone starts getting things ready for the trip to Eldoba Island. It's a busy day at the pier with workers hauling gear and supplies toward the ship. One of the workers stops and points out that there's zero room left for all these heavy logs and steel frames, but he tells the other guy that Rest actually told them to just leave all that stuff right there on the dock. The crew stands around the massive pile of lumber, confused why they're leaving building supplies behind, but it's an order. The worker just stares at the pile with a look that says he's definitely not getting paid enough to understand this. The Beastmen workers look over the massive pile of lumber left on the docks, and one of them wonders what exactly Rest plans to do with all these heavy supplies. While nearby, Rest tells Kieta how glad he is that everyone decided to stick with him, but Kieta just tells the young lord that they'd never dream of leaving him to handle things alone. Kieta explains it's because of a promise he made to Rest's mother, the late Lady Eliza. He swore back then that he would always be there to protect her son, no matter what. Hearing his mother's name brings back a few memories for Rest, and he realizes that he actually made a pretty big promise to her himself before she passed away. It was a vow to never use his true power in a reckless way that could cause trouble, and the memory takes him back to her bedside, where Lady Eliza asked him if he really understood the weight of what he was born with. She told him straight up that the gift he has is actually an S-rank craft skill. Young Rest is completely stunned and asks if he really has an S-rank skill. His mother just looks at him and confirms that he does. She explains that because people will definitely try to use a power like that for the wrong reasons, he needs to make sure he only uses it when there's a real emergency. Rest looks her in the eyes and promises his mother he'll do exactly that. Back in the present night, Rest gives a casual smile and tells Kieta that he thinks this situation finally counts as an emergency. Kieta looks at the young man with total respect and says that everyone is counting on him now. Rest says okay and starts heading over to the docks, leaving Kieta behind as he walks toward the cargo, where he stops in front of the giant pile of logs. He notices that the workers have cleared the area out just like he needed. The wind whistles through the quiet harbor as Rest stands alone before the massive stack of wood. He gets a serious look in his eyes and tells himself it's time to get to work, asking if they should finally begin. Just like that, some huge wooden structures and ladders start going up as the construction kicks off. The Beastmen workers just stand there with their mouths open, totally shocked by what they're seeing in the morning light. One of them points out that the entire pile is just gone, while the other guy swears the logs were right there last night. But the group has already moved on, setting sail for Eldoba Island and hitting the third day of their trip across the sea. Up on the deck, the sailors suddenly spot something on the horizon and shout out to get everyone's attention, as Rest and the maids rush to the railing, with Rest yelling out that the island is finally in sight. It's not a normal island though, it's a massive vertical rock cliff that towers way up into the clouds. Rest can't even look away, his eyes wide as he takes in the sheer scale of the place they're supposed to call home. While the others are shouting about how amazing it looks, Rest realizes Kieta was right, this place is something else. The sailors start getting pretty nervous, asking each other if it's even possible for people to survive on a giant rock like that. Rest just looks up at the peak, while the crew wonders how they're even going to explain any of this to Lord Bergs. Rest looks out at his new home with a huge grin. He says this is the freedom he's been waiting for his whole life. And as the ship disappears over the horizon, someone notes that it's finally just their small group left on the shore. With the island development officially starting, Rest cheers that they should eat first. Kieta's stomach is already growling, but Agni tells him he has to wait a bit longer. In this world, some people are born with special powers called gifts. They're super rare abilities that most regular people believe are sent down from God. But the real story behind where they come from is still a total mystery that nobody really understands yet. Rest, who's now using his mom's maiden name after being kicked out, reaches out and yells for his power to activate. He knows he was given a crazy rare S-rank version of this power, so he stands his ground as massive wooden beams start flying through the air and snapping into place, finally showing off his insane craft skill. Kieta and the maids just stand there completely stunned, watching the wood move on its own like it's nothing. Rest's power only needs one thing to work. He just has to make sure all the raw materials are close enough for his gift to reach them. The wooden planks slide together and lock into place perfectly fitted. Metal screws lift into the air and swirl around the site like magic. The screws drive themselves into the wood, finishing the job quickly. Rest stands back and shows off the huge new pier he just finished. He explains that his craft skill lets him build pretty much whatever he wants, and Kieta looks over the work with a proud smile. The old butler tells the kid he did a fantastic job with the build. Rest just winks and says he couldn't have done it without the blueprints Kieta put together. But the real secret is that he doesn't actually need to be a master builder or spend years studying how things are put together. His gift is so broken that it just builds everything automatically. All he has to do is touch a blueprint, and his power reads the whole thing instantly. Tareen mentions she'd heard some stories about this from Kieta before, but seeing it in person is different. She tells him his power is honestly amazing. Fail is all smiles as she looks at the finished pier, joking that the structure itself is probably happy to exist now, and Tareen can't even hide how impressed she is, yelling out that Rest is basically a legend for pulling this off. Agni just stares at the results, finally understanding why the craft skill is such a big deal. Rest just laughs it off and scratches his head, telling Kieta he's just glad his power actually came in handy. Meanwhile, the old butler just stands there with a proud smile, happy to see the kid doing so well. Kieta doesn't waste any time and asks if they should move on to fixing up the cliff next, and he lets Rest know that he's already got all the blueprints prepped and ready for the next phase. Rest is totally down for it, giving the green light to keep the momentum going as he focuses up and commands his power to materialize once again. So the whole group stands back and watches as a massive wave of energy hits the cliff to start the remodel. Agni and Fail are completely blown away. They ask if his power lets him erase things just as easily as he makes them. Kieta watches closely and realizes that whatever gift Rest has, it definitely isn't limited to just one simple skill. So Rest tries to break it down, admitting he can't explain the details but figures it's just a secondary effect of his main power. He thinks it's all connected to the way he needs raw materials to build stuff in the first place. To show them how it works, he explains that just by holding his hand out, he can absorb any object into his inventory. And that's exactly how he plans to hollow out the entire cliffside to create a massive cave system for them. Fail is still trying to wrap her head around the physics of it, asking where all those heavy rocks actually go once they're gone. Rest just plays it cool, telling her they're all just tucked away inside him as materials for future projects. And with the path finally cleared out, he tells the group it's time to head inside and get to work. The plan is huge. They're turning the cliff into a full base with ramps, a cafeteria, drainage, and even an open-air bath at the top. The blueprint for the cliff base is massive, showing exactly where everything goes from the top floor bath to the chimney, and the whole place is connected by long ramps and a complex drainage system to keep the cave dry. Rest gets to work, holding out his hand and effortlessly hollowing out the rock to match his vision. After a while, Tareen shows up with a basket and suggests they all take a break for a meal. She tells them she's got Agni's homemade sandwiches and hot soup ready for everyone. Rest is totally on board, saying the timing is perfect since he was just starting to feel hungry. The group gathers around a lantern in the cave to enjoy their meal. Rest takes his sandwich and starts carefully poking at the middle of it, which makes Fail lean in close with a suspicious look, asking him what he thinks he's doing. Rest freezes up as she realizes the truth. He's just trying to pick the pickles out of his lunch. Agni calls out to Rest and tells him that being a picky eater really isn't a good look for a lord, so Rest looks pretty guilty and tries to apologize, but he still wants to defend his side of the story. He looks a bit annoyed and asks Agni what his food choices have to do with actually developing the land, but she doesn't want to hear it, telling him that keeping him healthy is part of her duty as his cook. Rest realizes he isn't winning this one, so he finally gives in and starts eating the pickles. He looks totally miserable while chewing, but Kieta just stands there smiling like everything is great. Later on, Fail comes over while doing dishes and asks Rest if he can help her out with some fresh water. Rest tells her to give him a second and holds out his hand to activate some water magic. And just like that, a stream of clean water starts pouring right out of his palm into the large pitcher. He fills it all the way to the top in no time, making things way easier for the girls. Agni looks pretty surprised as she realizes that Rest can even store plain water in his magic inventory. She asks him if he just filled it with seawater, but Rest explains he's been secretly stocking up from his family's well every day. Agni can't believe it and asks if his storage has no limit, or if the water will eventually just go bad in there. She wonders if it gets mixed with his other items, but Rest tells her everything stays separate so it never spoils. Rest admits he's tested it and can store things forever, which he thinks is actually a little scary. He tells the girls they won't have to worry about water for a long time, and Tareen seems really impressed. Fail gets a great idea and asks if she can finally take a bath since they have so much extra water. So Rest tells her to leave it to him and he'll get it sorted out right away. Moving on, they've got a full outdoor bath going under the stars, and everyone is having a blast. The girls look totally relaxed and happy to finally wash off the dirt from the road. The stars and the moon hang over the quiet cliffside as the night slowly passes, morning hits the island, and it's finally time for the group to get things moving. Rest leads Kieta and the maids to a massive rock wall at the base of the cliffs. He points it out and explains that if they hollow out this specific spot, they'll be able to get right into the heart of the island. Rest asks the crew if they're ready to get started, and Fail gets all hyped up, throwing her hand in the air. But before they start digging, Fail stops to ask Rest what their new home is actually going to look like. Rest repeats the word house, like he's just realizing they need one, then asks Fail what kind of place she's dreaming of. She doesn't hold back at all, shouting that she wants a massive, fancy mansion with flowers everywhere. Rest just smiles and tells her to leave it to him, reaching out toward the stone while Agni watches. He places his hand against the solid rock, and a small beep sounds out as his magic kicks in. The group finally makes a move, heading straight into a massive cave, while Fail cheers about getting inside the island. But reality hits them pretty hard 6 hours later when they realize the path is just a total dead end. Agni looks over at Rest and asks if they're really not going to be able to get through, and he just awkwardly agrees. So the dream of a fancy house is officially on hold while the whole crew sets up camp to live in the cave. It takes a few days of hard work, but they eventually manage to break a hole through the island's outer wall. Fail is the first to see the other side, shouting about all the trees as they pull the wagon out. Rest takes a look around and says they finally made it, officially starting his new life under his mother's maiden name. Agni lets out a sigh, admitting she was actually starting to get worried they'd be trapped in that cave for good. The group stands together at the edge of the woods, staring into a forest that looks way bigger than they expected. Tareen looks around at the dense trees and notes how creepy it is that they can't even hear any birds chirping. Tareen looks out at the quiet forest and wonders if they're really the only people on this island, and everyone else just quietly agrees. Kieta rubs his beard while thinking back to what he knows about this place. The group stands by the carriage in the middle of the creepy woods, while Kieta notes that none of this was in the official records. But since the original investigation got cancelled halfway through, he says they can't actually trust any of that old info anyway. The crew keeps pushing forward through the thick trees, leading their horses deeper into the unknown. Rest stays quiet for a second before his expression totally changes. He tells everyone that if the old records are trash, they'll just have to handle the investigation themselves. And his first move is to clear a path through all these trees so they can actually get the carriage moving again. Fail realizes this is the perfect time for Rest to use his crafting skills, and he tells her that's exactly what he's planning. But when they finally break through to a clearing, all they find is a massive pile of broken stone and ruined buildings. Fail looks around at the massive mess and asks what this place even is, while Agni points out that the house is basically a total wreck. Everyone stands there taking it in, until Kieta explains these are ruins left behind by an old expedition team. He thinks they might actually find something useful if they start digging through the trash. Rest is totally down for the idea and says they should definitely check it out. Agni tells them the girls will handle the food while the guys search, and Rest puts on a mask to deal with the dust before he starts hauling away heavy beams and tossing broken stone aside to clear out the middle of the room. Kieta looks at the damage and says some wild beasts really made a mess of things, so Rest wipes his forehead and says they'll have to warn the maids to stay safe. Rest wipes the sweat off his face and says he's glad they actually checked the place out before just tearing it all down. He spots a set of old, broken stairs leading up into the darkness of the second floor, so he starts heading up the creaky steps to see what's hidden away at the very top. Kieta follows him up, and the two of them find themselves standing in front of a heavy wooden door that's completely locked. Rest asks where they are, and Kieta thinks it might be the commander's office, which means there's a chance some important investigation files are still hidden away inside. Kieta explains that the kingdom had to ditch this whole expedition because the Gald Empire hit them with a surprise attack, leaving a ton of untouched research materials behind. It's a huge find, so Rest nods and says he gets why this room is so important. He thinks about just using his craft skill to absorb the door and get it over with, but decides against it for now. Rest points out that if he just absorbs the door, he might wreck the papers inside. Kieta nods, because Rest starts looking really closely at the handle and the shape of the keyhole to see if it's a type he knows, then tells Kieta he can probably just make a key for it. Kieta looks a bit worried, but Rest just smiles and calls out his craft skill, which creates a perfect key that slides right in and unlocks the door with a loud click. Kieta gives him a look and asks when he learned how to do sketchy thief stuff like that. Rest gets all nervous and says they had the same locks at school, so he just figured it out, but Kieta is still stuck on why a noble kid would even be messing with locks in the first place. Rest tells him to save the lecture for later and focuses on finally swinging the door open. The two of them step into the room as a huge cloud of dust kicks up from the floor. Kieta looks at the nearly empty shelves and points out that most of the stuff in here has been cleared out. Rest checks out the desk, but finds it totally bare, mentioning how there's nothing worth taking left behind. He tries to pull one of the drawers open, but it makes a weird sound, catching him off guard as he realizes the drawer is jammed on something. He gets a closer look and says something is definitely stuck inside. Rest manages to get it open and finds a small notepad that fell out, which Kieta thinks was just wedged in there, They open it up to find pages covered in messy handwriting and scribbles, revealing Rest reads it aloud, explaining that the notes are about an investigation into the possibility of indigenous people living nearby. Kieta tries to keep things calm, but Rest is already thinking ahead and says they'll have to go introduce themselves if people are around. Agni leans in to look at the notepad herself, noticing a detail that Rest might have missed. She stops him and points out that the specific sentence he just read is actually crossed out. Agni looks down at the notebook and agrees with Rest, saying that he's totally right about what's written. Rest looks pretty serious as he mentions how the official country data didn't say a single word about natives living here. He thinks maybe the original team just got confused by something else and crossed the notes out later. Kieta rubs his chin and brings up the investigation team's report, thinking about how they said there weren't even any signs of people landing on the island before. But things are feeling a bit weird now. Fail looks a bit disappointed and says it seems like the team just couldn't figure anything out about the natives. She leans in and asks Rest if she can take a look at the notepad for herself too. Rest tells her it's fine and hands the little book over. So Kieta asks if they should just move forward, assuming that someone else might be out there, leaving Fail holding the book up to her face, wondering if they really aren't the only ones living on this island. Fail confirms that she's found something and Rest looks over, clearly surprised by her sudden discovery as the notebook is held up to the bright sunlight to get a better look at the texture of the paper. Fail calls out to Rest and points out that one of the pages feels kind of bumpy to the touch, so Rest leans in and realizes she's right, asking if these marks are actually indentations left behind from someone writing on the page before it. He notices that this is the page right after the one that got torn out, which means there's a chance they can actually figure out what the missing text said just by using those marks. Rest reaches out and asks for a pencil, and Fail hands one over while asking if a colored one is fine for this. He starts shading over the paper. The pencil reveals hidden letters left behind by the pressure of the original pen, and the whole group watches in shock as the notes describe a spring deep in the woods, a person riding a monster and a child living there. Moving on, the last bit of the hidden message is revealed, showing that the person on the island is an elf. The group starts thinking about who might be out there, wondering if it's an elf or maybe even a fairy. Fail gets super hyped up immediately, shouting about how much she wants to be friends with them as Rest just watches her with a big smile on his face, happy to see her so full of energy. Agni looks a bit more unsure though, asking the others if they think whoever is out there might be scary, and Tareen adds to that concern, wondering if they'll even be able to understand what the other person is saying. Fail admits they might not speak the same language at all, but she's already got a plan for that because she figures if they just share some of her favorite snacks and sweets with them, then everything will be fine. She holds up a lollipop and says she's totally sure they'll all get along great. Kieta tries to get Rest's attention, while Rest just laughs and says he really hopes things work out that easily. Rest leans in and whispers to Kieta that he doesn't want to worry the girls with anything serious, and Kieta simply nods and says he's got it. Agni asks the group if they should grab a bite to eat, and Fail is all for it, shouting that they should definitely start eating. Agni hands over a stack of plates and asks Fail to take care of them, while Fail says she's on it and grabs them. Rest looks pretty stressed out and tells Kieta that they're in a real mess, which Kieta agrees with as Kieta points out that if humans were the ones clearing out the forest, then Rest knows the elves would never just sit back and let that happen. He explains that since elves live in the forest and have way more magic than humans, they're naturally pretty proud people. Rest even mentions that the kingdom is having a nightmare of a time trying to negotiate with them. He says he really hopes the elves aren't the reason why the last investigation failed, because the official records show the survey team just completely abandoned their mission on Eldoba Island. Rest and Kieta just stand there looking worried, realizing they might be heading into a disaster. Kieta tells the group he is going to keep an eye on the forest. Rest tells Kieta that he's counting on him, and then Rest decides he's going to spend some time looking over the notes. A couple of little birds are just hanging out by the ruins. Kieta gets to work, carefully checking out the materials he's using. Kieta calls out to Rest to report that the foundation inspection is all finished, and Rest thanks him for the update, so it's officially time for the Lord of Eldoba Island to step up. Rest says he's ready and tells Kieta he's going to get things started. He explains how he made the structure by hardening the stone he got from digging out the tunnel. Kieta hands over the blueprints, and Rest says the loading is complete as he scans them with his hand. Rest locks in and triggers his power, shouting out his craft command, and just like that, the ruins are flooded with light as a massive structure starts to form. A few hours later, the girls are standing there with their mouths hanging open, and Rest lets them know that this is officially their new home, a beautiful mansion built right over the old ruins. Fail is losing it with excitement because they finally have a roof over their heads, but Agni is still just stunned as Rest thinks about how his new family can finally live in comfort. They check out Kieta's room first, which is basically a giant library where he can keep all his books. Then they move to Turin's spot, which has a walk-in closet big enough for a whole wardrobe, and Fail's room is like a little secret hideout with its own attic area, which leaves Agni just staring at Rest while he gives a happy thumbs up. Finally, it's time to check out Agni's room. She pushes the door open and stops dead in her tracks, asking what this place even is, since the whole room is a special gift from the builder. Agni totally loses it when she sees what's inside. She's never seen anything this cute before. Turns out the room is packed with a massive pile of stuffed animals, and Rest stands there looking pretty proud since he made every single one of them with his crafting skills. Fail starts clapping and cheering because the surprise worked perfectly. While Rest thanks her for the help, Agni just stands there in total shock. Agni tries to play it cool and claims she never said they were cute, but Fail just laughs because she knows the truth. The house setup is actually pretty high-tech. There's a massive water tank on the roof that Rest fills up, feeding into ceramic pipes for the bath and dining room. The rest of the manor is just as solid. They've got a carriage house, a lobby for Kieta, and a moat to keep the monsters out. Rest sets up the lighting last. Since magic stones are expensive and hard to get, he only puts them in the shared spots like the kitchen and lobby. Rest finishes up the last of the lighting and says that should do it, looking pretty satisfied with how everything turned out. Agni's stoked about the new kitchen setup, saying cooking is going to be way easier now. She thanks Rest for all the hard work, but he just smiles and says it wasn't a big deal at all. Later on, Rest pulls Kieta aside to talk about what's next. Kieta asks if something is wrong, and Rest explains the situation. Turns out they've run through most of their building materials, and between the cotton and the hemp they used to get everyone's rooms ready, they're basically tapped out on supplies. Rest suggests they take a ship to a town nearby so they can finally stock up on everything they need. He tells the group he's counting on them to make the trip happen, especially since even though the Dine family gave them a decent amount of startup cash to work with, those funds are definitely going to dry up sooner or later if they aren't careful. Rest keeps the conversation going, telling Kieta that before they head out to the nearby town, they really need to scout around the area and find some local resources they can actually use for trade. With the plan set, Rest decides to call it a day on all the lordly duties, and Kieta agrees, suggesting they finally just relax and sit down for a good dinner. Smoke starts drifting out of the chimney as the day finally winds down. Everyone gathers around a table stacked with food. Rest leads the group, saying they should give thanks for being alive and for the food they're about to eat, with everyone joining in on the prayer. Rest notices Turin looking a little surprised, so he explains that saying grace like this was a big tradition in his mother's family. He gives them a big smile and thanks the whole crew for being cool enough to go along with it. The group digs into the night's meal, a hearty bowl of chicken and vegetable soup. Turin mentions how Lady Eliza would probably be really happy to see that Rest is keeping the traditions of the Kyle territory alive. Moving on, Agni chimes in while serving soup, saying it's a great habit to be thankful for food. She tells Rest to make sure he finishes every last bite without leaving anything. Turin holds up a pickle and reminds him to eat those too, making Rest panic. Rest puts his hands up and says he's definitely going to pass on the pickles. Kieta joins in, warning him he won't grow up big if he's picky. The sun sets, and a happy moon hangs over the house as everyone settles in. The next morning, the sun starts peeking through the clouds as a new day begins, with Rest looking out the window, thinking about how nice the weather is. Rest is just looking out the window when he catches a glimpse of something. This massive, hairy shape passes right by the mansion, making him wonder what it is. Outside the house, everything seems quiet, but inside things are getting busy as Rest gathers the maids. Fail asks him why he called everyone together like this. Rest starts explaining the situation, telling them that earlier this morning, he spotted a giant, round furball wandering around right outside the mansion walls. He mentions it could be a rare monster from the island's reports, but Fail looks pretty skeptical and asks him what he means by a furball. Rest says it looked just like the fluffy things on her head, pointing right at the round hair accessories Fail is wearing while she listens to his story. Rest stands there totally confused while looking at the group of round, fluffy creatures as Fail realizes they aren't just random furballs. Agni chimes in to explain that Fail actually stumbled upon these little guys earlier that morning while she was busy doing the laundry. And Fail adds that she honestly thought she'd just messed up Rest's clothes by washing them too much and created a bunch of lint balls. But then it turns out they were actually tiny birds hopping around the whole time. Fail starts wondering if the poor things are just lost, and Rest nods along, thinking the same thing as Agni just stares at one of the round birds, trying to figure out what she's even looking at. She thinks the whole situation is pretty weird and asks the group if they're seriously planning on keeping these things, when a massive noise suddenly rattles the house, sending Rest and Fail running to the window to see what's going on. Rest points outside and tells everyone that the giant furball monster he saw earlier is finally showing up. While Kieta looks on, mentioning that the sound definitely reminds him of some monsters he ran into back when he was still an adventurer. Kieta explains that the monster is a cockatrice, a hungry bird with sharp claws that usually looks a lot meaner, so seeing one this fluffy is totally unheard of. He figures the big bird is just out here searching for its chicks, which makes sense since Fail already went ahead and returned the little guys to their parent, but even though she thought that would be the end of it, the bird never left, and for some reason, the whole family ended up settling down in the carriage house. Kieta looks at the creature and points out that judging by its weird behavior, it seems like the parent bird is actually trying to hide from something, and while the birds look a bit grumpy squeezed into the horse stable, Fail is just glad they're safe. Kieta adjusts his glasses and stays quiet, clearly thinking about what could be scaring a monster like that. Kieta tells Lord Rest that for everyone's safety, they need to get back inside the mansion right away, as a massive beast stands near the trees, making it look like the forest monsters are finally closing in on the manor. Agni is still just relaxing in all those fluffy feathers, totally unaware of the danger outside, while Rest hears a noise from the woods and starts wondering if that direwolf was the one hunting the cockatrice earlier. The young lord of Eldoba Island starts getting nervous and says he'll use his crafting powers to build a cage, but Kieta stops him, pointing out that since it's a direwolf, the boy should just stay back and let his butler handle it. The beast starts moving fast, its huge face suddenly filling their vision as it gets closer, and butler Kieta lets out a grunt, bracing himself for a fight as he gets ready to protect his master. Rest panics and asks if the thing is coming for them, but Kieta just draws his weapon and yells that they only need to drive it off. But then the scary monster just lets out a soft whine, acting way different than anyone expected. Rest notices the massive beast isn't even trying to fight. While Kieta points out that the creature looks like it's barely holding on, the animal is just standing there over someone on the ground, making Rest ask Kieta what's actually going on. It turns out the beast is just licking the face of a passed-out kid, and they realize the animal was actually trying to help. Since it's an emergency, Rest says he's going to use his crafting magic to build a whole infirmary on the spot so they can get the kid into a real bed, telling the others he can make whatever else they need to treat the patient. Tareen checks the kid over and mentions that even though he's out cold, there aren't any big injuries, but she still needs to do a more thorough exam to be safe, which leads to her telling everyone that she's going to have to take the kid's clothes off to finish the checkup. Rest starts to head out to give them some space, but Tareen just shrugs it off and says it's fine since the kid is a boy, leaving Rest a bit confused as he asks how she's so sure, but she just smiles and says she already checked. Tareen just laughs to herself as she starts getting the kid settled in. She notices the clothes the kid is wearing are actually super high quality and mentions the tailoring is great, while Fail leans in clothes and can't help but notice the kid has really cute ears. Seeing those pointed ears makes her realize they've definitely got an elf on their hands. Since they're dealing with an elf now, the group wonders if anyone actually knows how to speak Elvish, leading Rest to look over at Kieta and ask if he's familiar with that kind of language or literature, so Kieta looks down at the bed and confirms he actually knows a little bit of Elvish himself. Agni steps up and says since the kid looks so weak, she's gonna go make some soup, but then she mentions she just hopes this kid isn't a picky eater like Rest is. Rest gets a bit defensive and asks why she had to bring his name into it like that. Fail looks over at Rest and Agni with a pretty annoyed face, telling the two of them they're being way too loud and need to pipe down before the elf kid finally opens his eyes. He looks up from the bed feeling completely lost and out of it. Rest and the entire group are leaning over him staring so hard it's creepy, making the kid jump back and shout, because he wasn't expecting a crowd. Rest tries to calm things down, saying he probably startled the kid, but then he starts wondering if they even speak the same language since the boy just stares back at him. After a second, the kid quietly asks where Falshi is, which makes Agni realize he's been understanding them this whole time. Rest gives him a friendly smile and asks if he's talking about the wolf from earlier, letting him know the animal is just staying outside for now. He keeps the conversation going, mentioning that the wolf looked pretty hungry, so he made sure to get it some food to eat. Rest reaches out a hand to introduce himself, explaining that while he hasn't been around long, he's technically the lord of the place, even if Kieta thinks that's only sort of true. He looks the kid in the eye and asks if he'd be willing to share a little bit about who he is. The boy goes quiet for a second, looking a bit overwhelmed, but then he finally speaks up and says his name is Koritoko. Koritoko starts explaining what happened, saying he stepped on something called a slate of flower just outside his village. Rest has no clue what that is and looks at the plant as the kid explains the local legend. Apparently, if you step on one, you get cursed and lose all your magic power. Koritoko holds up his arm to show them exactly what he means. His skin has turned completely black from the curse, and Kieta looks at the dark hand and mentions that while humans might be okay, Losing magic is a huge disaster for elves, since they literally need magic to survive. Kieta looks pretty serious about it while the boy warns everyone to stay back. He says that if anyone gets too close to him, the curse will spread to them too. That's why he ended up leaving his home. He didn't want to be a burden or cause trouble for his parents, so he just ran away. Rest looks pretty skeptical about the whole curse thing. He tells the group he never heard about anything like that back in school, and he can't really believe that just stepping on a random flower could do this much damage. Fail listens to the story and wonders if there's a logical explanation, asking if maybe it's just the pollen from the flower causing a reaction. Kieta listens to the idea and nods, saying that it's definitely a possibility. Rest keeps going, explaining that the legend of the curse might just be how people describe a bad allergic reaction. Rest turns to Tareen and asks if she can check the kid out more closely, and she says she's on it. He asks if she actually knows her stuff when it comes to medical things and sickness, so Tareen explains she spent a lot of time researching everything she could for Lady Eliza's illness back then. Because of all that studying, she's pretty sure she can help figure this out. She tells the group she'll have some solid results for them by later that evening. The day passes, and the sun starts to set over the house while Tareen finally comes back to tell them she was right. It's just an allergy to the flower pollen. Rest takes it in, realizing the scary curse was just a medical issue, and Agni agrees. Tareen explains that from what she knows, the plant is actually a pretty rare flower. She goes on to say the pollen only makes regular people sneeze, but it really messes with elves. She stops for a second, and then asks if there's even a medicine that can cure an allergy like this, looking pretty disappointed as she thinks about the lack of options they have. Tareen admits she doesn't have any of the right medicine on her, which leaves Rest feeling like they're stuck. But then she mentions the recipes are all in her medical book, so Rest tells her to let him see. He realizes the only real problem now is actually finding the medicinal herbs they need. Rest takes the book and starts flipping through the pages to find the right section. He stops on a page with a drawing of a specific herb and a bunch of notes on how to use it. Rest looks closely at the instructions, trying to figure out their next move. Rest stands there with his eyes closed. His mind is basically running at full speed. As he tries to remember, something clicks when he looks through his inventory and sees an item that looks just like the one in the book. He pulls up the full list of everything his craft skill has absorbed so far, scrolling through all the random materials he's picked up. He figures he must have grabbed the herb by accident while he was building the island's roads. Rest decides it doesn't really matter how he got it. He tells himself to just pull it out instead of overthinking things. He holds out his hand and activates his power. A few bright sparkles appear as the items start to materialize. A bunch of plant bulbs pop into existence right in front of Tareen, and Rest asks if these are what she was looking for. Tareen's face lights up instantly as she holds one. She yells out that this is exactly what they need. She's so pumped that she tells Rest she's going to start making the medicine right this second. While Fail and Agni stand nearby watching, both of them looking pretty happy that things are finally working out. The group is settled into the big mansion Rest built on the island, and inside, Agni asks Koritoko if he likes the soup she made. He tells her it's delicious and says thanks, but he's still pretty surprised, mentioning he had no clue a house like this even existed in a place like this. Agni just smiles and tells the kid they only recently showed up and got settled in. Koritoko repeats the word recently, like he can't believe it, and Fail confirms that's the case. Agni gets curious about the kid's home and starts asking him about the village where he lives, wondering if there are any other elves staying around there. Agni says nope, and then Koritoko explains that his village is actually for half-elves. He's half-human himself. Fail tells him that makes him just like Agni, which makes the kid look at Agni and ask if she's a half-blood too. Agni explains she's a feline beastman half-blood, and Koritoko finally gets it. Agni mentions it's going to be a while before the medicine is ready, so she asks Koritoko if there's anything else he wants to eat while they wait. Fail jumps in saying she wants chiffon cake, but Agni tells her she wasn't asking her. Fail ignores the shutdown and starts hyping up the food, saying Agni's cake is just super fluffy and delicious, making it sound like the best thing ever. Koritoko says he wants to try some too, and Agni agrees even though she's actually fine. Agni realizes that if they're going to bake, they'll need to go out and find some eggs. But then she remembers a big problem, which is that there aren't any chickens around here. She starts thinking about it more and realizes something even weirder is going on, because looking around at the cliffs, she hasn't seen a single bird flying anywhere on the whole island. Agni looks over and asks if they should go talk to Lord Rest about the bird situation, and Fail agrees right away while Tareen tells the little kid to just hang tight for a minute. The sun stays shining over the island as a few days pass by. And before long, Koritoko is outside playing and giving a massive hug to a big wolf, looking totally happy. Rest watches him from the side and smiles, mentioning the kid is looking completely better now. He gives all the credit to Tareen, saying it happened because of her miracle cure. A weird, loud squawk suddenly rings out, making Rest and Tareen stop what they're doing. The two of them look over with the kid to see what the deal is. Feeling pretty confused by Agni standing there looking super bummed out, so Koritoko asks her what's going on. Turns out she found a cockatrice monster, but she's sad because the bird won't warm up to her. Rest looks over at Agni and reminds her that even though the bird looks cute, it's still a monster. He tells her again that she really shouldn't be provoking it, but Agni is too distracted by how fluffy it is. She's basically obsessed at this point, saying she just wants to bury herself in all those soft feathers. Koritoko speaks up and calls out to her, offering to teach her the right way to befriend a cockabird. The group is a bit confused by the name, so the kid explains it's just what his village calls that type of cockatrice. He goes on to say that if they can manage to keep some, they'll have a steady supply of eggs. Rest and Tareen just stare at him for a second, feeling pretty out of the loop. Moving forward, Rest decides he's going to build the chicken coop Koritoko was talking about, while Kieta steps in and shows everyone the blueprints he already finished based on the kid's description. Koritoko agrees with the design, but gives them a heads up that a stone-only coop might make the bird stop laying. Rest looks over at the monster bird and its chicks, noting that even though they look tough, they're actually pretty delicate. He tells everyone to step back for a second and then puts his crafting skills to work, so it doesn't take long before the new chicken coop is totally finished and ready to go. Moving on to the food, Agni says everything is finished as she serves up a huge, fluffy white cake. Koritoko tries his very first piece and is completely blown away by how good it tastes. Kieta starts explaining some stuff about the birds, mentioning how they share the same habits as a cockatrice, specifically how they keep the fertilized eggs but just dump the unfertilized ones right out of the nest. Agni is just happy about the whole thing, saying it's awesome they finally have a solid source of protein, while Fail laughs and points out that the egg they got was basically the size of Rest's entire face. Rest agrees, saying that with a haul like that, they won't have to worry about food for a long time. Smoke drifts up from the chimney of the house as the sun stays high. Tareen mentions that Koritoko's parents are probably really worried by now, so Rest decides it's time to take the kid back to his village. He says since they're all living on the same island now, it's basically his job as the Lord to go over and introduce himself to everyone. Agni thinks that's a great idea and says they definitely need a gift. She suggests sharing some of that fluffy cake she just finished making. Tareen jumps in and says they should bring some Slada flower medicine. She's pretty sure it'll be super useful for the villagers to have, and Koritoko gets a bit emotional, thanking everyone for being so nice to him. Koritoko looks up a bit worried, asking if heading back home right now is really okay or if he'll just end up causing trouble for everyone. Tareen gives him a gentle pat on the head and tells him not to worry. She says he's all healed up now, so everything is going to be just fine. The kid just smiles, looking way more relieved after hearing those kind words. Rest makes the final call and shouts out for everyone to get ready. They're officially heading out to Koritoko's village. The whole crew gathers up on the tower balcony to look out over their new home. Before they set off, Rest looks down at the magic stone in his hand, feeling the weight of being the lord of this island. He's standing there making a thinking face when Tareen walks up and asks him if something is bothering him. He just tells her good morning and explains he was actually just testing out if he could store those magic stones they found. He goes on about how the stones provide power for stuff like lights, so he figured they should definitely bring them along, but that's not all he has. Tareen notices a pocket watch in his hand and realizes it's his mother's old clock, which Rest quietly confirms. Tareen looks at the old clock and mentions how nostalgic it all feels. Rest says it would be a real problem if the clock's magic ran out while they were escorting Koritoko, so he had to do something about it. He then asks Tareen if all the preparations for their departure are moving along okay. She tells him that everything is completely ready and they can head to the village whenever he's set to go. The head maid gives him a quick thank you. Looking totally prepared for the trip ahead, Rest mentions they already checked the direction of the spring from the tower, and he's confident Koritoko will know the way home once they finally reach that spot. He looks off into the distance, thinking about the details of their mission, specifically the notes about an elf child and someone riding a monster. It turns out Koritoko told him those notes were about his people, since his villagers usually hunt while riding on top of wolves. The spring deep in the forest is actually right by Koritoko's village, and since the old expedition notes never mentioned a village, it's probably tucked away a bit further than they thought. Kieta looks over at Rest and suggests that maybe just the two of them should handle the escort for Koritoko, thinking about the logistics while his random hobby of bridge appreciation is noted. Rest is feeling cautious, mentioning how there are monsters on the island strong enough to tear down the investigation buildings, so he's pretty sure the path ahead is going to be dangerous. Kuretoko just looks at him confused, asking why they're worried when there aren't any monsters around, telling them everything is perfectly safe because of the holy beast. He points out that the beast is the one keeping the forest clear of any real threats, while Rest just stands there thinking it over, wondering what this holy beast is all about. Kuretoko looks pretty peaceful while explaining that the sacred beast is always watching over everything. It apparently makes sure that nobody comes around and ruins the forest. The kid mentions that the beast visits the shrine near the spring all the time, so everyone in the village makes sure to leave offerings for it whenever they can. Rest thinks the whole thing sounds amazing, but then he starts getting a little nervous, wondering if the beast is going to be mad that he cleared out a bunch of trees with his magic. Kieta takes it all in and figures that if this beast is really protecting the area, they can finally relax a bit. He decides he's going to spend his time looking over the old documents left behind by the previous investigation team while he looks after the cockabirds, and Rest is happy to have the help. Since the maids are actually trained for combat, Kieta suggests leaving Rest's safety to Fail and the rest of the group. Kieta heads out, letting Rest know he's going to go grab Fail and the rest of the girls from outside. The sun stays tucked behind the clouds as the group gets settled in at the new place. The big coca bird just stands there looking completely confused by everything, while Agni stares it down with this intense look, mostly because she secretly has a huge weakness for fluffy things. Rest notices her acting weird and tells her she really doesn't have to force herself to look after the birds, since Fail is already pretty used to handling them anyway, but that absolutely crushes Agni, who can barely whisper out a no. She starts spiraling, crying about how she's totally useless as a bodyguard for Rest while Fail is already in a bird suit serving dinner. Agni figures if she can't fight, she at least needs to be useful by taming the little ones, which makes Rest feel a bit awkward. To cheer her up, Rest asks Agni if she'll come along with him to go find something to eat. Agni looks pretty emotional about the plan, giving a quiet nod and agreeing to go, while Kieta turns to Fail, telling her he's officially leaving Rest's safety in her hands. Fail tells him to leave it to her, promising to show off everything she learned in martial arts. And just like that, the whole group finally heads out together, moving deep into the forest. The woods are thick with trees and mushrooms everywhere they look, and Kuretoko mentions he talked to the horse, Rinalant, about pulling the carriage so they don't need a driver. Rest is actually impressed by that, asking if all half-elves can talk to animals, but Kuretoko explains it's just his family, which is why he was the animal keeper back home. The sun eventually starts setting over the trees, and the group gets ready for a night of camping. While Rest is knocked out sleeping, Fail stays on guard since she's actually a real fighter. While everyone is camping, Fail tries to get Agni to wake up. Agni wakes up and asks what's going on. Fail tells her she just saw a fluffy little creature outside. Agni is surprised by the word fluffy, but she says she's actually curious too. She's just worried since everyone else is still asleep right now. Even so, Agni can't stop thinking about how soft and cute the fluffy thing looked, so Agni and Tareen decide to sneak out into the bushes following a light. Tareen's eyes go wide as she catches a glimpse of something in the distance, shining through the dark woods where a mysterious glow is coming from. Agni says she can see it too, noting it's actually more of a light pink than white. Tareen is impressed, saying Agni has some seriously good eyesight for seeing that. Agni just stares at the little creature, saying it really is pretty cute. Someone is stepping through the thick grass near the campsite, right by where the group has their carriage parked for the night. Restdine finally wakes up and sits up in his bed, sounding a bit confused as he looks around, realizing something is off. He asks where Agni and Fail are since they aren't around, and Tareen thinks about it for a second. She admits that now that he mentions it, she hasn't seen them anywhere, just as the wolf lets out a loud bark to get their attention. Kuretoko points toward the woods and tells Rest that the wolf can smell the two girls in that direction, leading them deep into the forest where the light is shining through the trees. They eventually find this huge hidden area with a waterfall and some old stone buildings, and Agni stands there looking at the water, asking if it's a spring and saying how beautiful it is. Fail starts getting a bit worried about how far they've walked, asking Agni if she thinks they can actually make it back. Agni tells her she's got better eyes and a better nose than most people, so they should be fine, though she adds a probably just to be safe. Fail thinks about how she was the one who talked Agni into this, but she never expected her friend to get so serious about it, until Agni suddenly stops and covers her nose. She says she smells something really weird, which just leaves Fail looking confused. Agni lets out a sneeze, saying the smell is like some gross beastly monster stench. It's clearly bothering her, so she points towards some stone ruins and suggests they head over there. Fail asks if she's doing okay, but Agni admits she's feeling so off she might have trouble even standing up, which completely shocks Fail. Right then, a dark shape with a sharp horn moves through the bushes near the bridge, leaving Fail standing there with a totally blank look on her face, as she looks over and asks if there was actually something hiding in the bushes. Agni is totally wiped out, slumping over and leaning her weight against Fail's shoulder. Fail catches her and asks if she's doing alright because Agni can barely keep her eyes open, telling Fail she needs to take a break and rest for a bit. Fail just stares at her, looking pretty worried. She never imagined her friend would push herself so hard that she'd end up in this state, while they sit together on the edge of the stone bridge. Fail looks around, wondering if there might be a monster hiding somewhere nearby, but she eventually turns back to Agni and apologizes. She admits she only brought her out here because she thought Agni would love seeing something soft and fluffy. It turns out Agni was actually feeling pretty down since that cockabird wouldn't act friendly with her at all. She looks away, looking a bit embarrassed while she thanks Fail for the support. She confesses she might have been trying to rush things too much, which just leaves Fail feeling a bit confused, until Agni explains her real goal. She says she really wanted to tame that bird so she could be more useful to Lord Rest. Fail gets a playful look on her face and calls her out. She asks if Agni didn't actually just want to be friends with the bird because it was so fluffy, leading to Agni blushing like crazy. She stammers out that maybe that was a little part of it, while Fail just smiles at how cute her friend is being. Fail gives a little laugh, but Agni stays serious and says it's true she really wants to be useful to Lord Rest. Fail tries to cheer her up, telling Agni she's already reliable and that her cooking is actually amazing, making Agni blush a bit, while Fail adds that she thinks her friend is doing great just the way she is. Agni looks down and says she isn't good at fighting or martial arts like Fail is, so she feels like she wouldn't be able to protect Lord Rest at all if there was ever a real emergency. She feels even worse about it because she's a half-beastman, and usually they're known for being strong, so she starts opening up about her family. She tells Fail that she has an older brother who is currently working as a spy back at the Dine House, doing all kinds of secret work. She explains that the only reason they were hired was because half-beastmen have crazy fast reflexes. But then Agni admits her own reflexes were actually terrible, and she always felt like she was just a burden to her brother. Agni slumps over, feeling pretty worthless since she doesn't have the typical beastman strength, and says she couldn't have complained if they just kicked her out, but Lady Eliza always praised her cooking. Remembering how Eliza called her food delicious, Agni explains that's the only reason she could even be a maid. Fail listens to the whole story and says she gets it, then tells her friend she hopes she can at least get along with those cockabirds, promising she'll be right there to help her out. Suddenly something rustles in the tall grass nearby, making Agni freak out and yell that something is definitely hiding. Over by the carriage, Rest calls out to both girls, and Fail looks back feeling a bit relieved, but then a massive blur streaks across the field at crazy speeds, heading straight for where they're all standing. Rest sees the thing closing in and his eyes go wide as he realizes just how fast this new threat is moving, so he yells for everyone to watch out right as it slams into the dirt. Rest and the maid stand frozen as a massive white creature with a single horn blocks their path, looking down at them. Someone screams that it's a monster, wondering if they're dealing with some kind of horned beast invasion. Looking at the beast, Rest realizes he actually knows what this thing is because Kieta told him about them back in the day. He remembers that unicorns are only nice to pure maidens, but they're basically wild monsters to anyone else. Apparently, a ton of people end up dying every year when these things decide to go on a rampage. Rest starts sweating a bit, realizing that since he's definitely not a maiden, this situation is looking pretty dangerous for him. He randomly blurts out that he hates pickles, while Koritoko screams about it being a holy beast. Koritoko looks at the creature and asks for a second if this unicorn is really supposed to be some legendary holy beast. The creature actually opens its mouth and says it isn't a unicorn but a unicorn. Rest just stares with his mouth wide open, completely shocked that the animal actually just spoke to them. The unicorn starts going off about how normal unicorns don't actually get how the world works, while Rest just stands there looking completely lost as the beast complains about them taking lives instead of seeing the possibilities. The creature looks serious, arguing that as long as there's love, it shouldn't matter if the girls are pure maidens or not. It asks Rest if having multiple women around is enough for his fantasies, but Rest is totally drained by the long talk. Fail looks confused and asks him what this horse is even saying. The unicorn recognizes them as the lily flowers from earlier, which makes Fail wonder if it's talking about her. The beast continues, explaining how it's been watching them from a distance while they were hanging out by the pier. It goes on until Tareen catches on to what's happening. She smiles and calls the creature out for peeping on Fail and the others. The unicorn blushes like crazy after being called a naughty horse for its behavior. The unicorn acts all offended, huffing that he isn't some kind of vulgar creature, while Rest gets super excited and points out to Koritoko that the holy beast can actually talk, which leaves the kid feeling totally baffled. Koritoko asks if that's really the only thing Rest is focused on right now. He wonders if there isn't something way more important to call out regarding the beast's behavior. Koritoko admits he was surprised by the talking at first, but the fact that the beast was creeping on the women is what really shocks him. Moving on, the unicorn starts sweating and asks if Koritoko is that boy from the local village. He immediately starts begging the kid to keep this whole thing a secret from the villagers so it doesn't ruin his reputation. He explains he's been worshipped as this big sacred creature for ages, but Tareen just shuts him down. She tells him he's not mysterious at all, he's just a talking horse. The unicorn admits it's a bad habit of his, just like they said. Rest and Tareen just stand there listening while he explains that once he gets going, he literally can't stop talking. Some villagers in the background are seen shouting for the holy beast, but the unicorn says that whenever he ran into villagers, he just acted like a normal horse and stayed far away to keep his distance. He tries to remember exactly when that was, trailing off as he thinks back to the past. Tareen notices the vibe and sighs, telling the others it looks like a really long story is about to start. The unicorn looks over and apologizes to the group. He says it's just been a crazy amount of time since he actually had the chance to talk to anyone else at all. Tareen looks pretty confused and repeats the phrase back to him, asking what he means by a long time. So the beast explains that there used to be monsters all over the place back in the day, and he made a point to talk to every single one of them whenever they showed up, which might explain things. The unicorn explains that after a while, the monsters just stopped coming around the place altogether. Rest looks pretty skeptical and asks if the monsters only stayed away because he was pestering them so much, and he points out that it definitely wasn't any kind of holy power keeping them back. Tareen looks on with a flat expression while the beast admits that he actually really wanted to strike up a conversation with the villagers as well. He says it happened a long time ago, but he actually did try to speak with the humans one time, remembering how all the young women in the area rushed over to him the second he showed up. In that moment, he really thought he had finally hit his popular phase and everyone loved him. But he stops for a second, thinking back to the actual words those girls said to him back then, which leads right back to the present where Agni yells out that the horse smells absolutely terrible. The beast is stunned and Agni just holds her nose with a look of pure disgust on her face. The beast looks down, saying that's exactly what people told him back in the day, and he says he's going to take off now. But just as he's turning to leave, the beast says he won't ever go near humans again, choosing to just watch them from a distance like always. Koritoko yells out to the holy beast because the kid says there's no way he can leave yet since they finally just got a chance to talk. The beast is surprised and asks if he's actually serious about wanting to talk. Koritoko agrees immediately, and he says he wants to hear a ton of stories from the beast about the old days. Koritoko points out that the beast knows the whole history of the village, so he should come back and tell everyone about it. But the beast looks a little embarrassed and mentions that he still smells pretty bad, which makes things awkward. Koritoko says it's totally fine and that everyone can handle a little smell. Tareen looks annoyed while Agni looks like she's about to lose it. Agni is completely shocked by the idea and can't believe she's being ignored. Rest looks at the creature and wonders if that stench is even gonna come off. The group makes a choice right then to give the holy beast a deep clean. They set up near the river with a tub while the beast waits on the grass. Fail smiles and asks if they should start by washing the beast's body first. The beast starts stuttering, completely shocked that they're actually gonna touch it. It mentions how a maiden shouldn't do this since it might ruin her. But then the creature starts blushing, thinking a chance like this might never happen again. Rest shows up with a massive brush and yells that it's time to scrub. The beast looks back in total shock while Agni stands there just looking disgusted, and she seems like she's barely holding it together from how bad everything smells. The cockatrice explains he actually bathes every single day because he's terrified of maidens telling him he smells like a beast. He even mentions how he tried rolling around in a patch of herbs recently. Apparently, he went deep into the forest just to find a way to get a nice scent. But Rest keeps scrubbing and asks if rolling in those random forest herbs was actually the reason he smelled so bad. Rest finally finishes the bath and the beast is looking completely sparkly and clean. The group gathers around to check the results, and Agni admits the harsh odor has faded quite a bit, but Tareen notes that the basic beastly smell is definitely still there. Fail starts thinking of a solution and wonders if they could try one more thing. She suggests that a little perfume might be enough to mask the natural scent, and Rest agrees that's a perfect plan. Fail smiles and asks how the beast feels about using a sweet fragrance that girls usually like. The cockatrice gets pretty interested when he hears the perfume is a hit with the ladies, while Agni just stands there looking totally annoyed. Rest starts getting the ingredients together for Turin's special scent, which uses stuff like orange, vanilla, and some local herbs. He notes that most of these plants were actually found when they first started working on the island, but there's a catch. Rest explains to the group that they're actually missing the Severia flower needed for the recipe, so Turin asks what the flower even looks like, and Rest offers to draw a quick picture so she can recognize it. Turin takes a crack at the drawing herself and proudly shows it off, but the result is so messy that Rest completely loses it. It's just a chaotic pile of black scribbles that's supposed to be a flower. Rest stares at the masterpiece in total silence, thinking there's no way anyone could ever make sense of this. He honestly believes the drawing is so cursed that looking at it might actually break someone's brain, and since things are getting weird, he decides to just use his crafting skill to handle it directly. Rest looks down at the drawing and realizes it's been censored by the world itself, becoming nothing but a pixelated mess, so Turin leans in and asks him what she's even supposed to be looking at. The group starts questioning if this is really the flower they need, since the drawing is so bad they can't see anything. But Fail just smiles and says she did a great job drawing it, while the unicorn stands there looking like he's seen enough. Suddenly, the unicorn turns to Turin and tells her to grab onto his horns, which leaves Fail standing there completely confused, wondering why he'd even ask for something like that. The unicorn casually mentions that having a girl touch his horns feels amazing, though that's not the main point, and Agni gets a look of total disgust on her face, asking him to keep his weird fetishes to himself instead of sharing them. He ignores her and explains that there's more to it. He can actually read the thoughts of anyone who touches them. He adds that he'll literally die if he sees a man, leaving Agni trying to make sense of his crazy rules as they stand in the woods. The unicorn mentions that based on the description, he might actually know a spot where a bunch of those flowers grow, which gets Rest hyped enough to shout out that he's going to try touching the horns himself. But as he reaches, the unicorn snaps at him, calling him a fool and warning him that a man is never allowed to touch them. Rest just laughs and says the beast is surprisingly shy, while Koritoko stands there looking sad, wondering if he's also banned. Fail thinks the whole situation looks like a total blast and asks the unicorn if he can read her thoughts too, and without waiting a second, she reaches out and grabs his horn with a firm grip. The unicorn starts making a weird face and drooling from the contact, while Agni watches and says the whole thing is pretty gross. He manages to focus and asks Fail if she was just thinking about eating sweets and some of Agni's chiffon cake, and Fail is totally impressed, telling the holy beast he nailed it while acting like it's the coolest thing ever. She smiles and concludes that his mind-reading ability is definitely the real deal. Fail tells the unicorn he needs to stop peeking into people's heads and stick to reading the flowers, but the beast just looks dazed and promises to keep her secrets, while she keeps her hand wrapped tight around his horn, rubbing it as they talk. She admits she's never actually touched a horn before, noting that it feels surprisingly warm to the touch. The holy beast starts acting weird and tells her she can actually squeeze it way harder, letting out a creepy little laugh as Fail gives him a solid squeeze, making the beast let out a loud, bizarre sound that rings out through the entire forest. The unicorn suddenly gets a second wind and tells them the flowers are in a cave nearby, shouting for everyone to follow him while Agni just looks at him with total disgust. Rest mentions the guy really perked up out of nowhere, but Fail just smiles and says it's pretty obvious the holy beast is having a great time, leading them right to the mouth of a dark, rocky cave hidden away in the mountainside. Koritoko looks at the entrance and mentions it's his first time here, since everyone back home always warned him to stay away from this spot, and Turin stands by as they prepare to head inside. Fail explains that the scent of the Severia flower is actually what makes people so sleepy, and she finally realizes why taking a nap in this area felt so strangely calming before. Rest decides that since it's a bit of a trek, the three adults should be the ones to go gather the plants, so the group begins making their way through the dark, jagged entrance of the cave. Agni leads the way while Rest holds up a lantern to light the path for everyone, until they suddenly walk out into a massive, glowing cavern filled with white flowers. The flowers are everywhere, and one of the girls mentions how beautiful the whole place looks. Turin stands there in awe, saying she had no idea a place like this was even on the island, while Rest looks around and admits he really wishes Kieta could have seen this too. Agni looks back at him and suggests they just pick some flowers to take home with them. Rest looks at the white flowers and mentions how they'll really brighten up the dining table back home. Turin smiles and agrees it's a great idea, saying she's sure Kieta is going to love them. So Rest promises to only take a few to keep the scenery pretty and uses his craft skill to gather them. He's busy picking flowers when he suddenly stops and looks up because he hears a weird noise. And just then the whole cave starts shaking, making the girls wonder if it's an earthquake. Rocks start falling as a massive shadow moves in the back, making someone jump and let out a yell. Suddenly a faint voice asks for help, and Agni asks if there's actually someone else in the cave. Rest looks into the dark and thinks it might be one of the people missing from Koritoko's village, so he goes running off to find them while the girls yell for him to wait up. Rest just looks back and tells them it's all good, he's got his craft skill to keep him safe. Rest tells Agni and the others to head back the way they came while he moves deeper into the cave as a massive rumbling starts shaking the whole forest. The unicorn asks if it's an earthquake, and Turine mentions she's got a bad feeling about this, so Koritoko yells out to the group to check if everyone is doing alright. Rest stops and looks up. He sees something that makes his heart sink. There's someone hanging off a massive rock pillar, letting out a groan as they struggle. The person in the cloak is barely holding on with their fingertips, but then the ledge just snaps right off, sending them falling through the air. Rest reacts instantly and yells for his craft skill to activate, forming a giant stone hand that reaches out and catches them just in time. The girl in the cloak lands softly on the giant stone hand Rest made. Letting out a little groan, she looks around totally confused, wondering why the ground suddenly feels so different under her. Rest calls out from across the gap to check if she's doing all right, but she just stares back, so Rest scratches his head and asks if she's the one who caused all this, and she just nods. He tells her he's just glad she's safe and asks if she's hurt anywhere, then reaches out a hand and introduces himself as Lest, asking what her name is. The girl just stares up at him with wide eyes like she can't believe he's being so nice. She starts blushing and looks pretty flustered by the whole thing, but then she takes his hand as Rest starts to ask again, quietly telling him that her name is Estria. Fail and Koritoko just stand nearby with their mouths open, completely shocked by the whole scene. Someone calls out to Rest from a distance, and the second Estria sees who it is, she realizes it's her brother Kali. Rest is a bit surprised to see them reunited, but Estria doesn't waste a second before throwing her arms around him, crying about how she's been looking for him everywhere. Kali smiles and explains that he actually got cursed by a slate of flour, but thankfully Rest showed up and saved him. Estria is pretty shocked to hear that Rest helped him out too. Moving on, the group looks back on how they made a special perfume to use on the holy beast. Turine mentions it's her new scent now, while Kali just stands there confused about what a holy beast even is. One of the girls notices that the strong smell doesn't even bother her anymore, so Fail explains that as long as they apply the rub-on perfume once a month, the effect stays fresh. She holds up the jar, saying it has a sweet, sugary smell that reminds her exactly of Turine. The holy beast thinks everything is going great. He can tell the girls are looking at him way differently than before, though Agni looks pretty annoyed. Agni looks like she just realized something major, but she hesitates before speaking up as she points out that at this rate, the holy beast won't even be able to use the perfume, which really brings the mood down for the poor guy. Koritoko jumps into the conversation with a new idea, suggesting they just go and ask the local villagers for some help. He turns to his sister and says he's sure everyone back home would be more than happy to help look after the holy beast. Estria totally agrees and tells the beast it would be an honor for them to take care of him, making the beast look completely overwhelmed with emotion. He's never been treated like this before, so he nervously asks Estria if she and the villagers will truly accept him for who he is. Koritoko is all smiles as he says they should let the entire village hear the holy beast's voice, while Agni stands with Rest and the other maids, finally happy for the beast now that he's found a place where he belongs. Rest and the girls decide to let Astoria lead the way, following her deeper into the woods so they can finally reach Udarao village, a quiet spot tucked away under a massive, towering tree. Once they arrive, the holy beast walks right up to an old elf and greets him as the village chief, while the chief looks back and says it really has been a long time since they last saw the holy beast. The old elf starts thinking back, asking the beast just how many years it's been since they actually spoke. He mentions it was back when the beast was still just a young man, and Fail can already tell this is going to be a super long story. Rest realizes that the chief was one of the few who knew the beast could talk, but there's work to do, so they borrow the village plaza to get everyone together. Rest and his group start handing out the special medicine they brought to treat the Slate of Flowers curse, and soon word spreads fast. The villagers are shocked, asking if a cure for the flowers curse even exists. The elves are buzzing with excitement, and one of them points out that their hunting range is going to get way bigger since the curse is finally gone. The whole group turns to Rest and thanks him for saving their village, so Rest just smiles back and tells them he's really glad he could be of help to everyone. He lets them know that if they ever get into trouble again, he'll always be there to back them up. And just then, Koritoko runs into his father's arms yelling that he's finally home. His dad is just relieved to see him safe, looking down at his son while Rest and the girls watch them from the side. Rest says he's just happy the holy beast and Koritoko were accepted back into the village so easily, while watching the family together makes him get a bit quiet for a second. Seeing that bond makes Rest wonder if there's ever going to be a day where he has to face his own father again. But he looks around at his friends and the village, realizing that this island has already become his true home. Agni just stands there with a completely blank look on her face, But then Rest starts laughing and asks if he actually said something funny, so Agni tells him it's nothing like that. He just sounded exactly like Kieta for a second and she couldn't stop herself. Rest smiles and says if that's the case, he better get to work fulfilling his duties as the lord of this island. He decides they should start by talking to the villagers, but then a voice calls out to him. And it's Estria. She shows up saying she made a big meal to thank them for everything they did today. She looks really hopeful and asks the group if they'll please come join everyone for the food, but Rest stops in his tracks. He's staring at her and looks totally caught off guard by something. Estria is confused by his reaction, while Rest can't take his eyes off the animal ears on her head. She notices him staring and casually mentions that she's a beastkin, pointing right at her ears. Rest looks at her and asks if she's actually Koritoko's older sister, and Estria starts to open up about her past, explaining how she actually ended up washing ashore on this island, where she was lucky enough to be rescued by the local villagers. She tells him that she lives here with her younger brother and mentions how Corey's family has been taking really good care of her since she arrived. Rest realizes they aren't the only ones who found their way to this place, while Agni just listens quietly. Rest gets curious about where she's from and asks for her home country, so she tells him it's the Goro Empire, a place Rest knows is basically the land of the beastmen. Then she drops a bombshell, saying she was the third princess of that empire before she ditched her engagement and ran. Agni asks if it was a political marriage and Rest just nods, saying that's classic noble drama. Estria gets serious and explains that's exactly why she wants to fall in love and get married strictly on her own terms. Rest smiles and tells her he totally gets that, since he came here for freedom too, but then she suddenly grabs his hands and asks him to marry her. Rest just blanks out for a second, nodding along before the weight of what she just said actually starts to sink in. She just stands there giving him the most innocent smile, waiting for an answer. Rest finally finds his voice and repeats the word marriage back to her. But before things can get any more awkward, some guy yells for them to wait while jumping out from the trees. Rest and Agni both turn around to see who's crashing their conversation. Rest is completely caught off guard by the sudden intruder and asks the man who he's supposed to be. The guy introduces himself as Van and starts yelling at Rest for laying a hand on his sister. And he looks ready for a fight while Rest just stands there totally confused. Estria tries to get Van to stop, but he just tells her to stay out of it. He puts his hand on his sword handle and draws his blade with a sharp metallic sound, making it clear he isn't playing around. Van gets into a full combat stance and calls for a duel, which just leaves Rest even more clueless about the whole situation. Van explains that in his country, you have to be strong to marry, so he's going to find out if Rest is actually a worthy match for Estria. Just then, Fail the maid jumps in and asks what the hell he thinks he's doing to Lord Rest. Van is taken aback by the sudden interruption and asks the little shrimp what she wants with him. Fail doesn't back down and tells him she'll be the one to fight him in Rest's place. Van is caught totally off guard by the maid's sudden challenge and warns Fail that it's her own fault if she ends up getting hurt. So Fail just walks right up to him while he stands there waiting. Agni and Tareen start to freak out, telling them they shouldn't do this, and Rest tries to step in because the whole thing looks way too dangerous. But Fail is locked in, telling Van he's got one last chance to give up. She gets even more cocky and tells him to come at her from any side. Then she launches herself forward, shouting that she's coming for him. The rest of the group completely loses it and screams as they watch, only to see Van flat on his back instantly. Agni just tells Fail she was supposed to hold back. Van is sprawled out on the ground in total shock while over on the side Tareen wonders if he's even going to be alright after a hit like that. The guy can't even process the fact that he lost, but Fail just shrugs it off and says it was a piece of cake as she starts walking away. Van finally sits up looking completely lost. He asks what just happened because the whole thing was over before he could even blink. Agni watches him struggle and points out that she told him this was going to be a bad idea, but it turns out there's a reason Fail is so dangerous. She's Kieta's only student, and she's mastered a crazy amount of martial arts, meaning hardly anyone can actually keep up with her in a real fight. She's on a completely different level than most people, so she walks back over to see if he can even stand up. Van just stares at her like he's seeing her for the first time, and while he's still trying to catch his breath, Fail makes it clear she isn't interested in a rematch. But then Van suddenly drops into a formal pose and shouts for her to marry him. He's totally serious about it, leaving Fail standing there with a blank stare, completely confused by the sudden proposal. The whole group is just standing there staring. Rest is completely lost, while Agni wonders what's wrong with these siblings. And outside the house, things seem quiet even though it's pretty chaotic indoors. Back at the table, Estria tries to smooth things over by apologizing for how much her brother just startled everyone. So Van speaks up and admits he basically just let his feelings get the better of him right then. Rest rubs the back of his head and laughs it off, He says he was definitely surprised but tells them not to worry about it, but Van isn't actually backing down. He looks straight ahead and says he hasn't given up on this yet, and he makes a new deal. If Fail won't marry him, then she has to take him on as her apprentice instead. Fail just stands there for a second with her finger on her chin, really trying to process what this guy is even talking about. She finally tells him she doesn't really get the whole apprentice thing, but she's cool with being friends, which makes Van completely lose it with joy as he decides that basically means he's officially her apprentice now anyway. Van gets all hyped up and decides he's officially calling Fail master from now on, while Agni just watches the guy with a blank stare. She can tell these two are on completely different levels. Tareen just giggles and sips her tea, saying it's actually pretty nice to see everyone hitting it off, even if things are a bit chaotic. Right then, Koritoko and another island resident show up to say hi, and the guy asks the group if they're planning on sticking around and staying the night. He tells them they should definitely stay over. It'd make Koritoko really happy to have them around. But then the holy beast suddenly chimes in, announcing to the room that it's been watching everything go down, and it mentions having a ton of stuff it wants to sit down and discuss with the maids later on. Rest starts laughing and brings up how the holy beast is known for telling these super long stories, and he jokes that those stories would honestly make for a perfect lullaby. The beast doesn't find it funny though. It tells Rest he's way too casual about being that rude. The holy beast makes it pretty clear it would rather hang out with the maids than Rest, especially since it isn't even dark yet, which just leaves Rest standing there looking confused, while Koritoko tells the group it's finally time to get going, so the girls all start heading off for the night. Estria tells Lord Rest she'll see him tomorrow, and Fail makes sure to wish him a good night before the holy beast notices them leaving and tries to follow. Rest asks if they should go too, but one of the girls immediately tells the beast to stay back, mostly because Fail is hyped about the idea of the beast joining them for a bath. The holy beast isn't having any of it though, yelling that it's definitely not going in. Moving on to the next day, Rest spends some time talking to the village chief to get the lowdown on the island's history, and he starts off by asking the old guy just how long this village has actually been around, and if anyone else from the outside world has ever made it here besides Estria and her group. After that, Rest lets the chief know that he's actually the new lord of the island. It's a lot to take in, but from everything he's heard so far, it turns out this village is a lot more interesting than he thought. The chief explains that this place is actually a refuge for people who were chased away by the pureblood elves, and he mentions to Rest that he must have gone through a lot of trouble himself to end up here. Rest just brushes it off, saying it wasn't like that at all since he actually planned his own exile. Since he's not struggling now, it hasn't been a big deal, so he thanks the old man for being so open about the village's history. After hearing the whole story, Rest lets the chief know that he wants to start checking out the rest of the island and asks if he can count on their help, which the chief is more than happy to agree to. He tells Rest that they'd be glad to assist him with whatever he needs. The group gathers inside the village house to figure out their next move. Rest calls out to Estria and tells her that he's thinking about heading over to the cove where her group first landed on the shore, and he asks if she'd be down to guide them there. Estria gets a big smile on her face and says she'd love to show them the way. Then Van jumps in to brag about how beautiful the spot is and mentions they can even go for a swim. Hearing that, Fail gets super hyped. Fail starts wondering about the trip and asks how long it's actually going to take to reach the cove, since Rest knows they need to move fast. He mentions that if they're late, Kieta is definitely going to worry about them. Just then, Koritoko speaks up from the doorway. He asks Rest if the plan is still to go and investigate the cove, and he offers to help out. He tells Rest he'll go ahead and let Kieta know that the rest of the group will be coming home late. Estria takes a second to look at Rest, quietly thanking him for helping her out the other day. Rest looks a bit uneasy about the idea. He tells Koritoko that while the help is appreciated, he can't let him go back alone, so a weird unicorn suddenly pops its head through the window. It looks right at the group and asks Kieta if the girl is a maiden. Agni doesn't look impressed at all. She stares the horse down and asks if it was caught spying on their conversation again, but the unicorn doesn't even care. He gets all sparkly and dramatic, saying he guess he has no choice but to go with them. He starts bragging about how every maiden everywhere is jealous of him, but then stops and says he's getting distracted. The unicorn tells Koritoko to hop on its back, and the kid looks totally impressed, calling him a sacred beast. The horse starts bragging about how it can fly whenever it wants without those slate of flowers causing any problem. Agni watches this and admits she's actually starting to have a little bit of respect for the guy. So she looks him in the eye and asks him to make sure he takes really good care of Koritoko. The unicorn looks pretty proud of himself, getting ready to show off what he can do. He tells everyone to leave it to him and takes off like a rocket, moving way faster than anyone expected. With that settled, the rest of the group finally starts making their way toward the cove together. The sun shines over the massive cliffs as their big exploration mission officially gets moving. They reach a rocky opening, and someone points out that this is the specific cave that leads to the water. Rest is pretty hyped, wondering how the official investigation team managed to miss a place like this. Rest looks at the massive stone archway and decides it's definitely worth checking out, so the whole group starts heading in. Looking at the local map, the Lord's Manor sits way beyond the mountains, while the village is surrounded by thick flower pollen and dangerous monster nests. The path they're taking goes through a complex underground passage leading toward the coastal inlet. The map shows the area is full of magic-absorbing ore and volcanic vents, making it a pretty tricky spot to navigate, especially since the water here connects directly to the Great Maelstrom of Nart. As they step deeper into the cavern, someone yells out a warning to watch their step since it's getting pitch black. Van takes the lead with a torch while Rest holds up a lantern so the maids and Estria can see where they're going. Rest looks around at the jagged walls and mentions that the place feels like a giant maze, but Van just smiles and tells Rest not to worry because he's got the whole route memorized. Turns out the guy is as reliable as he is strong. They make it down a final set of stone stairs, and Van finally announces that they've arrived. The group finally reaches the underground lake, and Fail can't help but yell about how cool the water looks. Rest takes a look around and asks everyone if they should get changed into their gear right away since everyone is hyped up. Fail throws her hand in the air and gives a loud shout, ready to get the fun started as Tareen smiles to herself. She mentions being glad she took the time to make swimsuits for the whole group, mostly because she's got a huge thing for cute clothes, and with the massive cavern glowing above them, Fail doesn't waste any time. She screams that she's going for a swim and takes a massive leap into the air. It's no surprise she's flying like that since she's known as the strongest maid, and she hits the water with a huge splash. Watching from the edge, Van is totally impressed and tells his master how amazing he is for bringing them here. Rest and Agni just stand by the shore taking it all in, but over on the side, Estria realizes she's got a bit of a wardrobe malfunction. She notices the string on her top came undone and Tareen steps in to help her out. She shows Estria the right way to tie it so it stays put, explaining that it won't come loose if she does it like that, making Estria pretty impressed. She tells Tareen that she really knows her stuff when it comes to clothes. Estria looks over her shoulder with a shy smile, asking Rest how she looks in her new gear even though she's actually pretty tough. Right now she just looks totally adorable. Rest nods along and tells her she looks so cute, making her blush even more as he goes on to say that Agni and the other girls look great in theirs too. It's a nice moment for everyone, but Agni seems a bit embarrassed. Turns out the girl who's usually so composed is actually a pretty bad swimmer, and Estria doesn't let that stop the fun. She turns back and asks Rest if he's going to join them in the water, but Rest stays focused on the task at hand. He tells her he needs to finish surveying this part of the inlet first, so Estria looks at him and asks if there's anything the two of them can do to help out. Rest thinks about it for a second and decides to take them up on the offer. He tells the girls he's actually got a small favor to ask of them, and both Agni and Estria agree to help right away. They're all set to get to work by the campsite, leading to the three of them standing together at the water's edge. Huge fish are just drifting by in the glowing cave. Rest looks out over the water and figures that the fountain hole the village chief was talking about has to be right past this lake. And he explains to the girls how that massive hole actually sucks up seawater and fish from the ocean and dumps them right into the lake, meaning it's pretty much the same story for them and the half-elves who live here. As Rest points out that everyone ended up in this place after being brought in from the sea, so he starts putting the pieces together and realizes that Nalt's great whirlpool must be the thing connecting everything to this cave. And looking at the layout of the tunnels, he notes that while people call this place a cove, it's really just a one-way trip for anyone who falls in. Rest stands there thinking about how the whole setup is way different from any normal fountain he's ever seen, and looking up at the water spraying from the ceiling, he gets the feeling there's some kind of mysterious power behind those jets. So he pulls out a strange tool and decides he's going to start investigating the whole area immediately. Agni looks at the gadget and asks what it is, so Rest tells her it's a spatial magic measuring device he got from the village chief. Rest mentions that the royal research team actually used to own this device, but it was totally busted, so the chief told him he could just keep the thing if he managed to fix it up with his crafting skills. Agni looks pretty confused and asks why a regular village chief would even have gear from a royal team, so Rest explains how 3 members of that team got hurt and ended up separated from the group on this island. And while everyone else headed home because the government called them back, those 3 were just left behind. The people from Udarau village actually saved them, so they ended up just staying there and starting new lives. Rest peeks through the viewfinder and adds that the chief considers the old device a memento of those people. He tells Agni to plug the sensor in right there, though he warns her the magic meter takes a while to get a reading. Fail realizes Kali is a descendant of those researchers, and Rest laughs as he realizes Koritoko played a part too. Rest looks at the gadget and finally understands that their connection to the past is why the village accepted them. Rest explains to the group that it's totally normal for people from the kingdom to be seen as suspicious, which Agni finds a bit weird. Meanwhile, Fail is having the time of her life swimming and yelling while Rest starts telling them the real reason the people here were picked on, which he actually heard directly from the chief. The chief explained that the elves are basically split into two groups, those who want to keep things pure and those who don't mind mixing. The purity group is full of elves who live forever and refuse to marry anyone else. But then you have the other side, the ones who actually started the half-elf line by leaving their home and moving far away just so their families could grow. It's wild because even though they all started as one people, the whole race ended up splitting apart like this. The main reason it even happened was because they were all scared that their kind was just going to disappear one day. Because of that choice, the group that mixed ended up having kids who don't live as long and have way less magic, creating the half-elves we see today. The purity faction of elves eventually grew so much that they became the majority all over the world, but they used that power to treat the weaker, shorter-lived half-elves like total garbage. It got so bad that the purity faction actually claimed half-elves were just born to be slaves for the real elves, and they started pressuring other countries to round up and hand over every half-elf they could find. Rest explains that his own country was no exception to this, and because of all that pressure, they passed a law saying any half-elf found had to be turned in immediately. A pretty dark situation that Rest thinks the elders over in Udarao village were already fully prepared for. They knew the day would come when people from the kingdom would eventually show up at their door. Agni finally sees how everything went down, and Rest just nods along, agreeing that's pretty much the story. Rest realizes that for these people who fled to the island, just to find some freedom and escape the hate. Rest thinks about how this island is officially kingdom land, and he's been put in charge as the Lord. But even though he's technically supposed to tell these people they're his subjects now, he realizes he can't actually bring himself to say stuff like that to them. Rest reminds himself that he came to this island specifically to find his own freedom, so it feels wrong to just turn around and start ruling over others or taking their freedom away. He stays quiet for a second, looking pretty deep in thought, just trying to figure out a way they can all live together without ruining anyone's life. He's back to work with his tools, admitting he still hasn't found a perfect answer yet. Agni looks over and tells him she's sure he'll figure it out since he's the one in charge, while Fail adds that he's a genuinely kind lord who actually cares about what happens to his people. Rest finishes up his work with the camera device and thanks Agni and Estria for their help, but he's interrupted when he hears a couple of people calling out his name from further down the beach. Van and Fail show up looking super hyped, holding up huge nets full of fresh fish they caught, and since they've got plenty for everyone, Fail suggests it's probably time to take a break and eat. Agni immediately steps up to handle the cooking, telling the group she'll get the fish on the grill. The rest of the crew offers to help out, and they all start setting up a little campsite right on the sand. Once the food is ready, Van asks Rest if that measuring tool of his actually picked up anything interesting, and Rest gets serious, admitting the magic in the area is way higher and more dangerous than the elders said. Van is confused because he always thought having a lot of magic power was supposed to be a blessing, but Rest explains that for anyone who can't handle it, it's basically like being totally wasted on strong liquor. The group keeps chilling by the fire, but one of the villagers mentions that since they aren't magic users, they can't sense anything, and Rest just nods along while housing a piece of grilled fish, before saying they need to tell the village chief what's up. He stands up and tells everyone they'll head back to the village as soon as they're done eating, and later, back at the village, the chief notices that Rest's magic has gotten way stronger than it used to be. He thanks Rest for checking out the magic situation on the beach, but then, he catches Rest off guard by saying the village finally feels safe enough to officially become his subjects. Rest is totally surprised and asks the chief if he's really okay with making a huge decision like that so fast. The chief just shrugs it off, explaining that since they're all outcasts anyway, they don't really have anywhere else to go, and while they were prepared to just follow orders if a lord from the kingdom showed up, the chief admits they were actually ready to go to war if the new ruler turned out to be a tyrant. Rest gives a nervous laugh and promises he'll do his best not to turn into some kind of tyrant, but the village chief just smiles, telling him there's absolutely no need to worry about that. The chief shakes Rest's hand and says he's looking forward to working together, while Rest replies that the pleasure is all his, and the maids stand nearby, looking on with proud smiles as the deal finally becomes official. Later on, young Koritoko gets to ride on the unicorn's back, looking like he's having the time of his life. The 12-year-old kid's eyes are wide with total excitement as they head out. He suddenly shouts out and points toward the horizon, telling the unicorn that the place they're looking for is right there, and the unicorn just gives a serious look, saying he sees the spot and understands where to go. The magical horse rears up and kicks off, creating a huge burst of wind and dust as they move, landing its hooves firmly on the path as they finish their trip through the forest. Koritoko is blown away by how fast they moved, telling the unicorn it's amazing they got there in an instant. The magical horse stops right in front of the gate and realizes they've finally made it to Rest's mansion. The unicorn gets this serious look on his face, thinking about how the maiden Kieta is waiting inside. But as they walk up, Koritoko spots someone and calls out to Kieta, which makes the old man ask who they are. Kieta realizes it's the young Lord Koritoko standing there, so he immediately asks if Rest is with him since. The unicorn is totally confused and asks where Kieta is because he doesn't see a maiden anywhere nearby. The 65-year-old man just looks at him and calmly explains that he is actually Kieta, and suddenly, the horse's face goes completely blank as the reality of it all hits him. While the unicorn stands there frozen in shock, Koritoko ignores him to tell Kieta he has an update on Rest, so Kieta says he understands, and they start heading into the house to talk things over. Koritoko catches Kieta up on everything, explaining how Rest and the crew headed off to check out the cove. And he tells the old man not to worry because Rest has it handled, plus the maids sent over those flowers as a gift. Kieta takes it all in but still looks a little unsure about the whole thing. So he turns his attention to the unicorn and tells him it's a massive honor just to be in the presence of a legendary holy beast. The old man keeps the compliments coming by saying the horse has a crazy aura, which the unicorn totally eats up. Kieta leans out the window and asks if he'd be willing to hang out and share some of his life stories, which catches the unicorn off guard. But Kieta insists he really wants to hear whatever he has to say. The unicorn is more than happy to start bragging about his holy status, while Koritoko just watches them, totally confused about how these two are bonding so fast while the sun begins to drop behind the trees. By the time they finish talking, it's already deep into the night. Rest and the girls finally make it back to the house, all of them shouting out that they're home, and Kieta is right there waiting in the hallway to welcome Lord Rest back. The old man tells the whole group he's just happy to see they all made it back in one piece. Rest nods and then asks Kieta if everything went smoothly at the house while he was gone. So Kieta explains that he actually spent a huge chunk of his time just talking with the holy beast. The old man reflects on the conversation he had with the unicorn, saying it was a really special time since he got to hear so many legendary stories from the creature. Agni looks completely skeptical, asking if he's actually talking about that same unicorn, but Rest just smiles and says he's glad to hear they got along so well. Kieta mentions there are actually some important things they need to go over, which leaves Rest wondering what kind of stuff they need to discuss. While Koritoko is passed out on the sofa, Tureen suggests they keep talking over some tea and Rest says he's down for that, so Tureen goes to get everything ready. Agni says she's going to start on the food and asks Fail to help her out, which Fail is totally game for, bringing out a spread of cream stew with fresh vegetables and a homemade quiche. Agni looks a little shy while explaining she used the stuff they brought back from Udarao village, and the food is a huge hit, with Fail and Rest both saying it's delicious and really impressive. Rest tells Kieta how Koritoko's father was the one who grew all these vegetables, and then mentions that he's been thinking about building a road that connects their home directly to the village. He points out that even though the holy beast can make the trip instantly, going by foot is a real pain since it takes about half a day to get there. Rest kicks back in his chair and explains that if they could move between the village and the mansion without any trouble, they'd be able to have fresh vegetables on the table every single day. Agni chimes in with a smile, saying it would make her job in the kitchen way easier, but Rest tells the group that food isn't the only reason he wants to do this. He leans in over the tea and snacks, explaining that a better path means they could also go see Van, Estria, and little Koritoko whenever they felt like it, which makes Rest look over at Kieta with a big excited expression to ask him for a huge favor. He gets straight to the point, saying he wants to build a bridge that goes through the air so they don't ruin the forest, and then asks if that's even something they can do. Kieta takes a second to process the wild idea and asks Rest to give him one night to figure it out. Kieta gets to work right away, saying he's going to look through a bunch of documents to see what they have, and he'll also check out whatever construction materials are left over in the mansion. Rest tells him he's counting on him, and Kieta says he's got it as the next day rolls around. Kieta shows Rest some blueprints and says they're almost a perfect match for the bridge Rest wanted. Rest looks over the papers and says it's exactly what he was thinking, and he's sure he can build it. He starts scanning the blueprints and his materials while getting his gift ready to go. He tells everyone they're starting with the foundation for the supports and reaches his hand out, letting off a huge blast of energy that rips right through the ground. The unicorn is stunned, realizing Rest is just absorbing the earth to make a hole, and Kieta just watches, mentioning that this is where Rest's craft skill really starts to shine. Rest focuses his energy, using his hand to guide the floating stone blocks as they spin through the air, leaving Koritoko and Fail staring up with their mouths hanging open. With a huge flash of magic, the bridge structure starts slamming into place, and Fail shouts about how amazing he is. Koritoko asks if the whole thing is done, but Rest says it's not that easy. He explains that his range is limited, so he has to keep repeating the process over and over until he hits the limit of what he can build from where he's standing. Tureen watches him work and says they're all cheering him on, and Agni chimes in to let him know she's already got a ton of snacks ready for his break. A few minutes go by, and Rest finishes up the main supports for the massive bridge. Even the unicorn is surprised, admitting he thought Rest was just a space cadet. Rest is looking pretty stoked, telling the group he actually managed to get a compliment, but Agni isn't buying it, telling him flat out she doesn't think it was a compliment at all. Ignoring the shade, Rest shouts out that he's gonna give it his all until the whole project is finished. The bridge starts coming together bit by bit, stretching from Udarau village through the forest, all the way back to the manor and the massive Starview Tower nearby. Just like that, the bridge is officially done, and now everyone is using it to move wagons and supplies between the two spots. One of the elf villagers stops by to drop off some fresh vegetables, and Agni meets him halfway, mentioning she just finished baking a fresh batch of pancakes, so she wanted to share some with him as a thanks. Fail finds Rest and asks if he can help fix up a house, and he just smiles, saying it's no problem. Estria shows up looking excited and waves as she calls out to Rest, and Van is right there with her, yelling about how he finally came to see his master while Rest welcomes them both back. The whole group meets up in the forest clearing right by the edge of the new stone wall, where the massive bridge now towers over the landscape under the evening stars. A group of dwarves takes a good look at the construction, and one of them mentions how it's a pretty interesting structure. Back in the kitchen, a piping bag is being used to carefully fill up some fresh pastries, with Agni acting as the head of cooking, telling her student to be very gentle with it. It turns out she's teaching Estria, the third princess of the empire, who is trying her best to follow along. But Estria ends up gripping the bag way too tight, and Agni lets out a shout as the whole thing explodes, sending cream flying everywhere in a total mess. Estria stands there covered in cream and admits she probably put way too much strength into it, and she immediately starts apologizing for the mess while looking really bad about the whole situation. The princess sighs and says making sweets is just way too hard, so Agni explains that beast folk like them are actually twice as strong as regular humans, which is why doing delicate work like this is such a constant struggle for them to get right. Estria starts getting really emotional and says that if she keeps going at this rate, she'll never actually be a bride who's worthy of someone like Lord Rest. Agni thinks about the word strength for a second and starts considering a different approach, until she gets a bright idea and tells Estria that she's figured out a better plan. She asks why they don't just try making bread instead of sweets, and Estria looks up and repeats the idea back to her. Estria looks up with a lot of hope in her eyes and asks Agni if she really thinks she can pull this off. Agni gives her a nod and explains that since kneading bread dough takes a lot of physical strength, it might actually be a perfect match for her, which catches Estria totally off guard. She thinks the whole idea sounds great and asks Agni to please teach her how to do it. Agni tells her she's going to go get all the ingredients ready for them to start. They get to work and Agni cheers her on, saying the dough looks good and to keep kneading it. She mentions that Lord Rest is a big fan of bread, so he's definitely going to be happy with this. Hearing that makes Estria really smile, and she says she's just glad to hear he'll like it. She looks down with this determined look and says she wants to become a great cook too, because deep down, she's dreaming of the day she finally gets to become Lord Rest's wife. Estria is totally head over heels as she watches Lord Rest, while he takes a bite of the bread and says the flour from Astoria is actually really good. Estria lets out a small sound as things start to go a bit sideways. Suddenly, there's a huge mess in the kitchen and Agni just stands there looking completely shocked by the disaster. Looking at the state of the room, Agni sighs and says it looks like they've got a long road ahead of them. Tureen, the head maid, shows up with a smile and suggests a different approach, asking if Estria wants to try making some perfume with her for a change of pace, which catches Estria's attention. So she asks for clarification and Tureen says she's serious. Tureen explains that wearing perfume is actually a huge part of proper etiquette when going on a date with a gentleman. And while she talks about how fun it is to mix scents, Estria gets stuck on the idea of a date. With literal hearts in her eyes, she starts dreaming about a date with Lord Rest and begs Tureen to teach her everything. A wonderful fragrance fills the air inside the house. Tureen holds up the bottle with a smile, saying she finished it with a sweet and refreshing floral scent. She thinks it's a perfect match for a girl like Estria. Moving on, Tureen asks if they should try making one more and asks Estria to help out by grinding some petals for her. Estria picks the next batch and asks what kind of vibe this new perfume is supposed to give off. Tureen giggles and tells her that this one is the scent of an adult. She explains that it's for when a date with a gentleman starts getting serious, and they eventually find themselves alone together, which makes Estria stop and think about the idea of being an adult. Estria gets a serious look in her eyes as she processes the suggestion. As the day winds down, the focus shifts back to Estria. Rest mentions how much fun he had today while Fail walks up to him. But then Rest gets a serious look and asks if they can actually spend a little more time together. He leans in close and tells Fail that he really doesn't want to let her go, catching her completely off guard. She tries to tell him he shouldn't be doing this, but Rest just spins around and says no. It turns out he's overdoing the drama, and Agni watches as Fail gets flattened, thinking this isn't working out at all. Elsewhere, a young beastman girl is sitting outside with some small fluff monsters. Sighing because she messed up again, Tureen finds her looking pretty down and asks what's wrong, seeing that the girl completely failed at her laundry duty. The girl explains that her problem is she's just way too strong, so she ends up breaking everything she touches. Fail listens to the story and realizes that having that much power is actually a huge pain to deal with. Tureen looks pretty surprised for a second after hearing a suggestion. The beastman girl smiles and asks if Tureen can help her carry some laundry, even though it's a bit heavy. She's actually pretty confident, saying that if the job is just manual labor, she's definitely the one to help out. A few minutes go by and she's already proving it. Holding a massive basket of laundry over her head, Tureen is totally blown away by the help and makes sure to thank her for doing such a great job. The beastman girl just brushes it off like it's nothing and asks what she needs to handle next. Tureen asks if she can help fold the clothes, and the girl is more than happy to jump right in. With a big smile, Tureen hands over a specific piece of clothing, mentioning that it's actually Lord Rest's shirt. The beastman girl leans in and says she's just going to smooth out all the wrinkles in the fabric, but she gets this really focused look in her eyes while thinking about the fact that she's holding Lord Rest's clothes. While holding the shirt, Estria mentions she got a little sweaty, but then she starts smelling the fabric while suddenly realizing Rest is standing there shirtless. She covers her face and lets out a yell about how he shouldn't be taking his clothes off like that in front of a girl. She's totally flustered and peeking through her fingers when she accidentally grips the shirt too hard. The fabric just snaps in half, and she stands there holding the torn pieces while slumping over in total defeat. She starts apologizing, saying she's useless at helping out and even worse at practicing to be a bride. Agni tries to cheer her up by changing the subject, pointing out that the bread Estria made is finally finished and ready to be served. Tureen smiles and agrees that eating some food is probably the best way to move on, though it seems like the intense smell of the fresh bread is still a bit too much for the princess to handle. Tureen tells her not to worry about the shirt since Rest can just fix it with his craft magic. Right then, Rest walks into the room with a big smile. He doesn't seem to notice the mess at all, just commenting on how great everything smells. Vangora, the crown prince of the empire, shows up and mentions he's pretty hungry while the girls all stand there looking completely baffled. Van looks at their confused faces and asks if something is wrong, but Fail starts to explain the situation while Estria freaks out in the background, trying to stop her from saying too much. Van seems to realize something and speaks up. He reminds Estria that she is the princess of the Gorau kingdom, so it shouldn't really be a big deal if she isn't great at things like cooking or laundry. Agni is surprised by the comment, but Fail smiles and says a girl wants to do everything she can for the guy she loves. Van asks if that's actually true, and she doubles down, saying that absolutely includes chores like cooking and laundry. She goes on about how just the thought of making the person she loves happy fills her with total bliss. But Van just gives her a deadpan look, mentioning that when it comes to his sister, that kind of imagination is a bit of a stretch. Vangora tells Fail that her imagination is running way too wild, but she doesn't let it go and asks Rest if he can just make tools that won't break when she uses her full strength. Rest seems a little skeptical, asking if she really wants him to make indestructible tools while Agni agrees with the idea, saying that at this rate they won't have enough gear since it doesn't matter how many pots or tools they buy. They just keep going through them, leaving Rest to check his inventory, noting he has plenty of normal wood and iron, but he starts wondering what he'd actually need to build stuff that's truly sturdy enough. Kieta steps in and suggests that if they're serious, Mithril would probably be the most effective choice. Rest looks pretty surprised by the suggestion and asks if he's really talking about using Mithril, so Kieta explains that it's a super precious ore, making it the perfect material for the job. Kieta finishes his thought, explaining that Mithril isn't something you can just find anywhere. It's going to be a real pain to track down, so Van stops for a second like something just clicked in his head. He mentions that he actually remembers hearing some talk about that stuff in Udarau village recently. According to him, the village chief there is the best person to ask if they want the real scoop. Agni gives her approval since they've got a solid lead to follow now. Rest gets fired up and says they should head out immediately to find that mithril, and he wants Estria to come along. Fail starts giggling and teases them, saying the whole trip sounds like a total date. Just like that, the group officially starts their hunt for the rare ore, crossing a massive stone bridge as they head toward the village. Kieta sits up front and keeps the horses moving at a steady pace, while Rest tells Estria they should just relax and enjoy the ride like it's a date. She blushes and says she's totally down for that. Vangora shows he's a pretty considerate guy by saying he isn't about to crash anyone's date. He'd much rather stay behind and help Tureen and the others with their chores. So Tureen gives him a big smile and tells him that having an extra person around to help out would actually be a massive lifesaver. And while they're getting organized, she asks the group if they should go ahead and call over the Holy Beast to help them out as well. Agni doesn't seem to think that's a great idea. She just says the Holy Beast is doing perfectly fine exactly where he's at right now. Estria chimes in to let everyone know she's carrying the lunches Agni gave her, making sure to mention that she even helped out a little bit with the food herself, since she's clearly excited to be contributing to the group's trip while they head toward the village. Fail jumps into the conversation with a grin, telling Rest and Estria that she's going to be their personal servant for the day just so she doesn't end up getting in the way of their big date. She's clearly having a lot of fun teasing the two of them. Rest smiles and tells her he's actually looking forward to the help, but his mood shifts slightly as he looks toward the front of the carriage because he can't help but ask why Kieta has to be right there with them when they're finally trying to have a romantic date. Kieta just ignores the comment and calls out to him. Tureen reminds everyone that the real reason they're out here is to check on the mithril. She doesn't want them forgetting the mission, but Rest thinks she's being way too serious about it and says calling this an investigation is a bit of a stretch because his actual plan is just to find enough of the metal to make some really good cooking tools for the house. Kieta isn't having any of that casual talk. He stops Rest and asks if he even understands the insane price of mithril silver. He explains that just one plate made of the stuff is worth enough money to take care of a whole family for a month. So he breaks down how this rare metal is a top-tier choice for adventurers since it's super light and even reflects magic spells. The point he's trying to make is that finding a way to mine this ore would basically solve all the island's money problems. He keeps the lecture going, telling Rest that if he cares about the future of this place, he needs to take their income seriously. In the back, the mood is way lighter as someone points out how good Fail's snack looks. She just smiles and agrees like there's no stress at all. Kieta keeps yelling at him to pay attention, but Rest just tells him he already knows as the carriage continues down the path. The group finally arrives at Udarao village, a quiet little place tucked away in the trees where they meet up with Koritoko's father, who acts pretty surprised when the topic of mithril comes up. Turns out some of the rare ore was spotted inside a cave along the coast during a recent scouting trip, so the whole crew decides to head straight for the cave entrance to see what they can find. Mithril is a big deal because it naturally pushes back magic. It's perfect for keeping scary magical monsters away, and the local half-elves don't really mind the mining since the ore actually makes it harder for them to use their own powers. As they head inside the dark cavern, Rest mentions to the group that he's never actually been down this way before. Fail starts laughing and says the dark cave feels just like a test of courage. Rest and Estria seem to agree that it's got that spooky vibe. Rest tells them that back home, they actually have a place where people pay to walk through a dark mansion for fun. He explains how they use magic to make fake ghosts and scare everyone who goes inside. Estria thinks that sounds like a total blast. Fail jumps out and yells boo, trying to show everyone the best way to pull off a surprise. It works a little too well because Tureen actually screams, making Fail realize she might have gone overboard. While that's happening, Rest turns to Estria and asks if they should hold hands since the cave is getting pretty dark. He just gives her this super chill smile, waiting for her to answer, while Estria gets all flustered and manages to say yes, her face turning bright red as they start walking deeper into the cavern together. Estria starts to say something but gets caught up in her thoughts. She's mostly worried about whether she's squeezing Rest's hand way too hard or not. Rest notices and just adjusts his grip, making it a bit more natural so he can tell her that if they hold hands like that, it'll be fine. Estria just looks up at him and Rest smiles back, making sure she feels totally safe as they head further into the darkness. Kieta clears his throat to get everyone's attention, looking like he's about to say something important. He turns to Rest and asks if he can get an honest answer about something personal. He straight up asks if Rest had any actual experience with girls during his time at the academy. Rest doesn't even hesitate and just smiles, saying he actually had plenty of girlfriends back then, which makes Kieta sigh and scratch his head, noting how different Rest is from his brother Bergs. Rest just laughs and says his younger brother is way more of a man of integrity than he is. Fail chimes in with a laugh saying Rest was always popular and mentions a girl named Claire. But Rest looks totally lost and asks who that is, so Fail reminds him he was basically being chased by her. Kieda's face goes stone cold as he tells Rest he definitely can't let a comment like that go, so Rest just tries to play it off, saying he's a noble too, so being popular shouldn't be that surprising. Estria gets this scary look on her face and tells Rest she wants to hear all about his past girlfriends in great detail. She's gripping him so hard he has to tell her she's actually hurting him. She quickly lets go and apologizes, saying the words just kind of slipped out, so Rest suggests they just focus on exploring the cave. The group keeps walking through the rocky tunnels with Kieda leading the way using a map, until he stops at a solid wall and tells everyone they've finally reached the spot. Kieda explains that back when the half-elf ancestors first got to the island, they started digging a tunnel from the inlet, and even though they built up the land, the stories say there were a few places where they ran into trouble. Turns out their mining magic didn't work at all, so they just had to give up on those sections. Kieda figures the magic failed because there's probably mithril inside the rocks, but Rest isn't worried and says they should just go for it. Rest reaches his hand out toward the stone and calls out his craft magic, and suddenly a massive blast of energy hits the wall, lighting up the whole cave as he starts breaking through. Kieda looks on in shock as he realizes Rest's gift is actually strong enough to take in mithril, while Rest thinks to himself that this crazy power really is something given to him by the gods. Kieda agrees as Rest checks his screen, confirming he can definitely absorb the mithril straight out of the earthen wall. Tureen says this is exactly the kind of thing she expects from him, and Rest just laughs and thanks her. Tureen calls him over and points out that the cave actually keeps going way past the hole he just made, so Rest takes a look and suggests they all head a bit further in to see what's waiting for them. The group walks into a massive underground area that looks like it was carved right out of the rock. Estria picks up a cup and Tureen finds a plate, wondering why there would be tableware in a spot like this. Kieda gets a good look at the stuff and realizes the items are actually made from a mithril alloy, and then Rest looks around at all the gear and starts to wonder if someone is actually living down here in the dark. Looking up at the sharp rocks hanging from the ceiling, someone asks if maybe it's just a mole, but Rest and Tureen look further ahead and spot a dark opening leading deeper into the cave. Kieda's eye widens as he notices something moving around in the shadows. A weird gumo sound comes out of the dark, and this short guy with a massive white beard shows up. Fail starts screaming her head off while Rest and Kieda just freeze up, and Tureen yells that it's some kind of bearded monster. Rest takes off running while the bearded guy starts chasing them with a shovel, so Kieda tells everyone to get out of there immediately. But then Kieda stops and realizes the guy isn't just making noise, that language sounds familiar, making him wonder if he actually knows who this is. The bearded man stops swinging and looks up at Kieda, and then Kieda starts tapping his feet in a weird rhythm on the cave floor, leading into him doing this super goofy dance right in front of the guy like it's some kind of secret code. Kieda finishes his weird foot-tapping routine and stands perfectly still, waiting to see if it actually worked. Tureen and Rest are both totally lost, with Rest asking Kieda what's even going on, but the bearded guy just stares at him. He's got this really intense look in his eyes, focusing entirely on the rhythm Kieda just played out with his boots on the cave floor. Everything is quiet for a second while the bearded man slowly nods like he understands. Fail and Tureen are standing in the back with question marks over their heads, completely confused as the realization hits the group. Rest asks if that was actually the Dwarven language, and Kieda confirms that it was a specific greeting. He explains that an old adventurer buddy of his used to be really into that stuff, so he managed to memorize a few phrases. He admits he's not good enough to have a full conversation, but he's pretty sure he got the point across that they aren't enemies. Rest looks down at the guy's gear as the mood in the cave finally starts to shift. The shovel just rests there on the ground, showing that the bearded man has finally decided to stop attacking. Rest stands there thinking about everything that just happened and says he finally gets why the guy was so mad. It clicks for him that this cave was the guy's home, and he accidentally wrecked the place by absorbing it all. The bearded man just stares at him with a look of pure annoyance, making a frustrated sound as Rest reaches out toward the broken pieces of the man's bowl, moving his hand quickly while he focuses his energy and says craft to activate his skill. Suddenly, a bright light starts spinning around the shards. The bearded man watches in total shock as the pieces begin to mend themselves. The man's eyes go wide as he sees the plate turning back into one solid piece, and he immediately hoists the fixed plate into the air with joy. Rest watches him and says he doesn't really get it, but if she isn't mad anymore, it's probably fine. The guy is completely distracted now, just staring at how shiny and new his favorite bowl looks, but Rest still looks a little bit on edge, sweating as he waits to see if the tension is actually gone. Rest looks at the guy and calls him Mr. Dwarf. Noticing he looks like he's waiting for something to happen, standing right there is a huge, impressive mithril statue of a warrior. Rest stares at it and asks if it's really a mithril statue, feeling a bit confused as Kieta thinks for a second while the group explains how dwarves are basically spirits of making things. And turns out that every dwarf has a master they look up to, which means they only become real master craftsmen once they can recreate a statue of that master out of mithril. Fail speaks up and tells Rest she's positive the dwarf wants him to be the one to make it. And Kieta agrees that it looks that way while pointing out a pile of broken metal from all the failed tries. Rest looks pretty unsure about the whole idea and asks if it's really okay for him to be the one making it. Kieta tells him it's fine. In fact, they can even use the job as an excuse to take back the mithril the cave absorbed. Rest thinks it over for a second and tells the group he guesses they're right about the dwarf. So the group heads back to the village to fill everyone in on what happened down in the cave. Koritoko gets all hyped up and asks if there were actually dwarves down there. And Kieta replies that it's pretty strange since dwarves usually don't like to stay in one spot for too long. But Kieta points out that their presence is actually proof the entire area is one giant mithril vein. Moving on, Kieta watches as Rest hands a new item over to Estria while Agni explains it's a tool, a frying pan made of mithril. Estria is stoked and says that with something this tough, even she won't break it, but the second she puts any pressure on it, the metal just bends like paper. Estria and Fail both stare at the ruined pan, completely shocked by how easily the mithril gave way. Kieta looks at the warped pan and says he finally gets it, which makes Rest ask him what he means. Kieta gets a serious look on his face and explains that what Rest made isn't just a regular mithril alloy. It's actually the result of Rest's crafting skill automatically sorting out all the iron and other random metals. He basically stripped away every single impurity, refining the material into a super high-purity mithril silver. Estria is totally blown away and calls it incredible, but Rest just looks at her and asks if it's really that big of a deal. Kieta looks over at the stacks of glowing metal and tells Rest that between his power and this island, they've managed to get their hands on mithril silver, which sells for a crazy high price, making it a massive resource for the future of the Kalil territory. Even with the big news, Rest just sighs and says he isn't really feeling the hype, so Fail calls him out for having such a weak reaction. Rest looks off to the side, thinking about how even if they've found a literal mithril mine, there's no way they can keep digging unless they can find a way to convince everyone else to go along with it. Rest looks out at the night sky and mentions that if he were a dwarf, he'd probably just live a lazy life, which makes Kieta sigh and tell him that such a laid-back mindset is exactly what he expects from him. Inside the mansion, Tureen is busy pulling petals off a flower, whispering about love and hate as she goes. She lands on love with the very last petal, while Fail just stands there watching her act super weird. Tureen starts blushing and giggling to herself, wondering out loud if it means he actually loves her. Fail tries to get her attention to see what's wrong, but Agni just watches the whole thing in total silence. Rest walks into the room and waves, asking Tureen if she could get some tea started for him. Tureen stays frozen like a statue, so Rest tries calling her name again while Fail looks on worried. Fail realizes Tureen is useless right now and offers to make the tea instead, which Rest is totally fine with. As Fail heads off, Rest turns to Agni and asks what could have possibly happened to make Tureen lose it like this. Agni starts to explain the situation to Rest, telling him she knows exactly what's been going on. Apparently it all started last night when Tureen went out to pick some herbs for the house. While she was out, she spotted a dark figure standing alone by the waterfall and got curious, so she hid behind some bushes and called out to see if anyone was actually there. It was a shirtless, muscular guy just standing in the moonlight, and Tureen couldn't look away, which is when the man noticed her and immediately started to apologize for the intrusion. Tureen reached out to stop him from leaving, quickly telling him her name and asking him to wait. She even went a step further and asked the mysterious stranger what his name was. The guy looked completely caught off guard, but instead of answering, he told her to forget they ever met. Tureen just stood there with her face turning bright red, totally stuck on that one interaction. The guy tells Tureen to just treat the whole thing like a bad dream and forget about it, and he says goodbye before running off, leaving Tureen calling out after him in total shock. She just stands there under the trees, looking completely dazed by how fast everything happened. With a blush on her face, she starts wondering if that guy was just a ghost or a phantom, but she realizes it had to be real because her heart won't stop fluttering like crazy. Back at the house, Agni finishes telling Rest the story while Fail brings over some tea for him. Rest thinks the whole thing is pretty wild and says it sounds like something from a storybook, although he can't help but wonder if anyone actually living on the island fits that description. Agni admits that she's never seen a guy like that around here before, and then Fail starts to wonder if a person like that even exists or if Tureen imagined the whole thing. Tureen is still caught up in the moment, trying to process everything as she insists that what she saw wasn't just some dream. She even holds out a button the guy dropped to prove it. Agni just watches her and says it's pretty obvious Tureen has fallen for the handsome stranger. And Estria gets all excited, thinking the whole thing sounds like a totally lovely story. She leans in and asks for more details, which Tureen is more than happy to share as they keep chatting. The sun starts to go down over the house as things quiet down for the evening over by the animal pens. Agni heads out to tell the birds it's finally time for dinner. She looks at them while they crowd around the food, noticing they've actually grown a lot. And since they're getting bigger, she figures she should probably give them all names pretty soon. She just smiles at how cute they are. Meanwhile, some guy walks past the window in the back. A young man with light hair stands in the shadows, looking pretty serious. Agni catches a glimpse of him, and her face just goes totally blank. She jumps back, pointing and asking who the heck he is, while the guy just calmly takes a step inside the room like he belongs there. He steps into the light, looking like a total stranger but wearing familiar clothes. Agni's eyes go wide as she asks if it's really Master Kieta. He seems impressed she could tell it was him, and says he actually has a lot to explain about the whole situation while the sun hangs high over the farm outside. Agni loses it, yelling about how he has a secret gift to make himself young again, and he just casually says yeah, that's exactly it. Kieta explains he hasn't mentioned it to a single person since he started working for Lady Alyssa, looking back on his old self as he admits this is the first time he's ever been stuck like this and can't change back. Kieta explains he's been secretly using his gift to take on a younger form whenever he needs to handle manual labor, but he shows them his hand while admitting that lately, his power hasn't been acting right at all. Rest stands nearby and guesses that Kieta's gift probably just went out of control, which is when the unicorn pops in to say this kind of thing happens all the time to humans once they start getting old. The unicorn admits it's still a gift anyone would want, leaving Agni completely stunned by the whole situation. Agni finally snaps out of it and asks where he even came from, while a title identifies him as the Holy Beast Unicorn. He casually mentions he saw the whole thing from the sky, but Agni just thinks that's totally gross. Rest looks at the creature and tells him he's actually pretty knowledgeable for a holy beast, so the unicorn looks at Kieta and suggests he should just relax and enjoy being young for a while. Kieta shoots that idea down immediately, saying he can't do that because it's going to interfere with his daily duties. Kieta decides it's time to just come clean and explain how his gift works to Rest and the rest of the group, but he looks pretty stressed out about the whole thing as he tries to find the right words to say. The unicorn jumps in to explain that whatever Tureen saw was just Kieta's body reacting after he used his power, and he points out that if Tureen realizes her big crush is actually just Kieta, she's going to be absolutely crushed. Kieta admits that's the last thing he wants. He can't stand the idea of seeing her that sad. Someone mentions that while that's a fair point, they still have to deal with the current situation. The unicorn suggests that Kieta should just go find a place to hide until his body goes back to normal. But right then the door swings open and Tureen stands there. She looks right at Kieta and says she finally found him. Kieta just freezes up. He's completely caught off guard now that she's standing right in front of him. Agni and the unicorn both stare in total shock because their plan to hide him just failed miserably. Tureen looks right at the young man standing there and tells Lord Rest that this is the person she's been looking for, which gets Rest thinking about how this guy is the one Tureen has feelings for, while Fail just can't get over how tall he is. Kieta tries to play it cool and confirms he's the guy, and Tureen tells him it's a huge honor to meet him again. Rest steps in to welcome the newcomer to Eldoba Island, introducing himself as the lord of the place, Rest Kale, but Agni starts getting really nervous. She looks at Rest like she's about to spill the beans on who this guy actually is. She just goes for it and points right at him, telling everyone that this person is actually Lord Kieta, and she tries to explain that there's a specific reason why he looks so different right now, but Tureen just laughs it off and asks Agni what she's even talking about. She's totally convinced that this person can't be Kieta. Tureen points out that Kieta isn't nearly this young, even though Agni keeps insisting that no matter how you look at him, it's definitely Kieta. The group starts heading inside as Rest suggests they shouldn't just stand around talking and that they should all go have some tea instead. Agni watches as the group heads inside, thinking about how Kieta just got dragged away, and realizes that as of right now, she and Lady Agni are the only ones who actually know that the guy is Kieta. The unicorn leans in close and whispers that this is going to be a little secret between just the two of them. But Agni isn't having any of it and tells him to stop saying such disgusting things right now. The unicorn tells her she shouldn't be so shy about it. She immediately snaps back that she isn't blushing. As they settle into the room, the unicorn suggests they should all just sit back and watch over a young girl's dream. Inside the room, the young-looking Kieta looks over at Rest and asks if he's actually enjoying all this confusion. Rest just smiles and says that come to think of it, He really wonders where Kieta went off to causing Kieta to nearly choke on his drink, while Rest casually mentions to the others that he has a butler named Kieta. He goes on to say that the man is an irreplaceable and precious member of his family, making Kieta go quiet.